There is something deeply comforting about settling in and letting someone walk you through a world that has been burning for 200 years. The Fallout universe is one of those rare creative spaces where the questions are more interesting than any answer could ever be. Every rusted terminal, every crumbling vault door, every skeleton arranged in a posture that tells a story. The world is built from layers upon layers of mystery, and most of those layers were never meant to be fully peeled back. So get comfortable. The lights can stay low. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing that needs your attention, just the soft crackle of a distant radio station and the hum of fluorescent tubes in a world that has been figuring itself out ever since the bombs stopped falling. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through some of the deepest, strangest, and most hauntingly unresolved mysteries the Fallout series has ever offered us. Some of these have partial answers, some have competing explanations, and some of them, even the people who built these games could not fully agree on. That is not a flaw. That is the whole point. Section 1. The question at the end of the world: who actually dropped the first bombs? Every story has a beginning, and the beginning of the Fallout universe is also its ending. On the 23rd of October, 2077, the world that had been building toward catastrophe for decades finally crossed the line it could never come back from. In a span of approximately 2 hours, nuclear missiles arced across continents, detonated in city centers, and scorched the atmosphere into something barely breathable. 229 years later, survivors and their descendants are still picking through the bones of what was left behind, still rebuilding, still arguing over who gets to control the water, the electricity, and the future. But for all the mountains of lore the series has accumulated across 6 main entries, dozens of DLC expansions, multiple spin-offs, a tabletop role-playing game, and now a live-action television series, one question has drifted through all of it, like smoke from a dying city. Who fired first? The answer, as it turns out, depends enormously on who you ask, and when they were asked. In the world the games build, the 2 primary powers leading up to the Great War are a retro-futuristic version of the United States and the People's Republic of China. The world of Fallout diverged from our own sometime around the mid-20th century, taking a hard turn toward Cold War politics that never thawed, resource wars that never resolved, and technology that followed a very different curve, one that gave humanity nuclear power and robotics and cryogenic preservation, while somehow never developing the microchip the way we know it. The result is a civilization that feels like someone preserved a 1950s Popular Mechanics cover and let it run for another 100 years. America annexed Canada. It fought what became known as the Sino-American War over resources, specifically oil in Alaska. China launched a ground invasion of Alaska in 2066 that the United States eventually repelled using power armor-equipped troops. Tensions escalated. Then came October 2077. What the games never definitively spell out, at least not in any single declarative, unambiguous sentence, is which side made the first move. For years, this was one of those questions the community debated endlessly, assembling evidence from terminal entries and loading screen hints, and the way various NPCs spoke about the war when you pressed them on it. Then in 2023, Tim Kaine, the co-creator of the original Fallout game from 1997, sat down for an interview with a Fallout historian and content creator named TK's Mantis. They talked for about 90 minutes, and near the end of the conversation, Kaine mentioned something he seemed to assume everyone already understood. He described the sequence of events that led to the war with the calm matter-of-factness of a man describing something obvious. According to Kaine, China fired first. But the reason China fired first is where the story gets genuinely interesting and far more morally complicated than a simple question of aggression. Kaine explained that the United States had been conducting research into what the games call the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. In-game, FEV is the substance responsible for a staggering number of the mutated creatures wandering the wasteland. It is what turns people into super mutants when exposed in sufficient doses. It is linked to the creation of Deathclaws. It is one of the most consequential pieces of pre-war science in the entire Fallout universe. And before the bombs fell, the US government was running experiments on it under conditions that were, at minimum, a violation of international agreements. China found out. According to Kaine, The Chinese government had demanded the United States stop its bioweapons research. On the surface, the US agreed. In practice, the research simply moved to a new location and continued. When China discovered that the promises had been broken not once, but repeatedly, their leadership faced what Kane described as a genuine existential calculation. A nation already strained by famine and resource depletion, watching its primary rival hold an illegal edge in a weapon with the potential to rewrite biology itself, running out of conventional options for winning the conflict they were already in. So they made a choice, and the world ended in 2 hours. Kane expressed genuine surprise during that interview when TK's Mantis reacted with the energy of someone receiving a major revelation. Kane, apparently, had simply thought this was understood. He seemed almost baffled that the question had been debated for 26 years. From where he sat, the evidence in the games always pointed in this direction. A Fort Independence terminal entry in Fallout 3 describes Chinese bombers being detected first, prompting an immediate retaliatory strike by US forces. Other scraps of documentation scattered across the wasteland lean the same way. And then, quickly, Kane pulled back. He noted that technically it was not his call anymore. Bethesda owns Fallout now, and they decide what is canon. He suggested, somewhat coyly, that perhaps the bombs came from some unspecified rogue nation. The Cazador, as one journalist memorably put it, was already out of the bag. But the story did not stop there. In April 2024, Amazon's live-action Fallout television series arrived and offered its own answer, one that is significantly more dramatic and considerably more on-brand for a story about the corrupting power of corporate greed. The show, which has been acknowledged by Bethesda as canonical to the franchise, reveals through a series of flashbacks centered on a character named Cooper Howard that the first nuclear detonation was not ordered by any government at all. It was Vault-Tec. The logic, as the show presents it, is bleakly straightforward. Vault-Tec is the company that built the underground vaults where survivors sheltered during and after the war. Without a war, there is no need for the vaults. Without the vaults, there is no business. The show depicts a meeting between Vault-Tec executives and the heads of several other powerful corporations, including a younger version of Robert House, the man who would eventually control New Vegas, where Vault-Tec pitches the idea of a nuclear war as the foundational event that would allow their clients to begin their various social experiments in the vaults, each one a controlled laboratory for building a particular kind of future society. Time, as Vault-Tec's representative in the show puts it, is the ultimate weapon, and the vaults would give them more of it than anyone else in the world. This version of events implies that Vault-Tec, a private company, dropped their own bombs to manufacture the crisis that their entire business model depended on. The subsequent panic between the United States and China, each seeing detonations and assuming the other had fired, would have spread within minutes. 2 hours to end the world, triggered by something neither government actually ordered. Now, here's the piece that makes this a genuine unsolved mystery, rather than simply a timeline with competing sources. Both of these explanations exist simultaneously within the franchise's canon, and they do not fully contradict each other. If Vault-Tec dropped the first bomb, China's nuclear retaliation research, and America's FEV experiments still all happened. Tim Kane's explanation of China's motivations still holds up as backstory, even if the trigger event was a private corporation's calculated arson. You could, without straining too hard, imagine a version of the story where Vault-Tec saw the China-US tensions and simply struck the match, knowing both sides were already holding the fuel. Or perhaps neither explanation is the complete truth. Perhaps the bombs came from a rogue faction inside the American government, as some terminal entries hint. Perhaps some combination of actors reached the same conclusion simultaneously, and fired more or less at once. The Fallout universe has always been better at consequences than causes, and there is something thematically appropriate about a world whose apocalypse cannot be pinned on any single decision. What Kane said in that interview has a philosophical weight that lingers long after the factual question fades. He put it this way: technically, China started the Great War by launching the first nuclear bomb. But you could argue that technically the United States started it by conducting illegal biological weapons research and then repeatedly lying about stopping it. Neither party is entirely free of blame. That is not an answer. That is a mirror. And Fallout has always been better at mirrors than answers. Because the thing about the Great War is that it is not really a mystery about nuclear weapons or geopolitics. It is a mystery about human nature, about the way institutions, governments, corporations, military establishments build toward catastrophe through increments so small that no single person ever feels responsible for the whole. About how the most total destruction in the history of the world can emerge not from an act of pure evil, but from a chain of rationalizations, each one internally coherent, each one handed off to the next person down the line. The wasteland is what you get when everyone was just doing their job. There is also something quietly affecting about how little it matters, 200 years after the fact. Which specific missile left which specific silo first? The people picking through rubble in Diamond City and Goodneighbor and the NCR settlements do not spend their evenings debating Vault-Tec versus the Chinese Communist Party. They are trying to figure out where their next meal is coming from. They are trying to keep the water purifier running. They are trying not to get shot by raiders or eaten by death claws or drafted into Caesar's legion. The cause of the apocalypse is a question for historians and philosophers, and there are not many of those left. The wasteland does not have the luxury of retrospect. It only has the next sunrise, dim and irradiated and beautiful in its own scarred way, coming up over a world that destroyed itself before it could figure out how to be better. And somewhere in a terminal in some forgotten vault, a log entry from before the bombs fell is still waiting to be read, quietly insisting that none of this was inevitable, that choices were made, that things could have gone another way. That is the Great War mystery. Not who lit the fuse, but why they had ever been handed a match. If you are still with us, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. Across time zones and continents, the wasteland finds its audience. And if you have not subscribed yet, it helps more than you might think. It keeps this channel going and means you will not miss the next one. Section 2. Something older than the bombs Ugh Qualtoth and the horror beneath the Dunwich building? The Fallout series has always had a complicated relationship with the supernatural. The world it depicts is one where almost everything strange can eventually be traced back to radiation, or FEV, or pre-war science run amok. Mutants, ghouls, most of the bizarre creatures populating the wasteland there are explanations for them, even if those explanations sometimes stretch credulity in the opposite direction from magic. The series leans hard on the idea that science, not the supernatural, is responsible for the horrors of the post-apocalyptic world. And then there is Ugh Qualtoth. The first hint of something genuinely, uncomfortably different appears in Fallout 3, tucked into the southwestern corner of the Capital Wasteland map, in a building that has no roads leading to its parking lot. The Dunwich building sits in a barren patch of jagged terrain, and from the outside it looks like another ruined office block. Something went wrong here a long time ago. The immediate area around it is stripped bare in a way that feels wrong rather than simply post-apocalyptic. There are no obvious reasons to go here. No quests direct you to this location. You simply find it because you were walking in a direction and a map marker appeared. Going inside is a decision the game never forces you to make. It only rewards you for making it in ways that are difficult to describe as rewarding. The Dunwich building is structured in 3 sections, each one requiring you to descend further beneath the surface. The entrance level is dark and hostile, populated with feral ghouls who behave with slightly more intensity than their counterparts elsewhere. There are audio logs near the entrance, a series of recordings left by a man named Jaime, who came to this building looking for his father. Jaime's father had found a book. That is where it starts. An old book, apparently warm to the touch, that had consumed the older man entirely. One night, he simply got up and walked away without explanation, leaving nothing behind except the memory of how changed he had seemed in the days before he left. Jaime followed. The audio logs document his descent. Each one is a few degrees further from ordinary distress and closer to something that no longer sounds quite like a person. By the 3rd or 4th recording, Jaime is talking about temples, about feasts, about the return of something. Continuing deeper, past ghouls that seem almost to be standing watch rather than simply wandering. A player character can experience hallucinations, flashes of what the building looked like before the war, complete with people who move through them like footage from a film that should not exist. The visions are brief and disorienting, and they do not explain themselves. They simply show glimpses of something being prepared, something being anticipated. The deepest level is called the Virulent Underchambers. At the bottom of this descent, in a cave that extends beneath the building proper, there is an obelisk. It is not human in its aesthetic. It is black stone, carved with imagery that does not parse as any known pre-war iconography, wrapped in something like vines, with what appears to be a human form half emerging from, or half dissolving into its surface. Skulls line its base. Feral ghouls cluster around it in postures that look uncomfortably, like supplication. A voice repeats a name near the obelisk. Sometimes it says Alhazred, sometimes it says Gieth. Both of these names meant something to Hamey in his final recording, which was otherwise largely incoherent. The Fallout 3 official game guide, one of the primary lore documents for that game, describes the obelisk as dedicated to a previously unknown entity and notes, with a dry humor that barely covers the genuine strangeness of the situation, that further research into grimoire-related oddities is unlikely given that most investigators are currently dead. The entity the obelisk is dedicated to is named Ugg-Qualtoth, and here the mystery deepens in a very specific way, because the name and the imagery are dense with Lovecraftian reference. H.P. Lovecraft's 1929 story, The Dunwich Horror, takes place in a Massachusetts town called Dunwich, the same state where Fallout 4 is set. The story features a cosmic entity called Yog-Sothoth, described in Lovecraft's fiction as the key and guardian of the gate. Ugg-Qualtoth is described in the official game guide in language that mirrors Lovecraft's description of Yog-Sothoth almost exactly. Ugg-Qualtoth is the key and guardian of the gate. The name Abdul Alhazred, which Jaime mumbles in his final recording, is the name of the fictional author of Lovecraft's Necronomicon, the ultimate forbidden book of eldritch knowledge. The building is named Dunwich. The entity is named in language that deliberately echoes Lovecraft's cosmic horror tradition. The book that started everything warm to the touch, corrupting to anyone who comes too close, is a variation on the Necronomicon. This would all be a clever, well-executed homage if it stopped here. But it does not stop here. It never stops. The connection between Fallout and Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror deepens with the Point Lookout DLC for Fallout 3, which adds a swamp region filled with degenerated, mutated people called swamp folk. In Point Lookout, a player can encounter an old man named Obadiah Blackhall, who lives in a manor called Blackhall Manor and who very desperately wants a book. The book is called the Kriv Bekni. It has ended up in the hands of the swamp folk, who are using it in their rituals. If you recover it, you have a choice. Give it to Blackhall, or give it to a woman named Marcella who warns you that Blackhall should never be allowed to possess it. Obadiah Blackhall, it emerges, is a worshipper of Ugg-Qualtoth. Giving him the book triggers his celebration. The entity, he believes, is about to return. Cut content from the quest reveals that Blackhall's ancestors were related to a man named Richard Dunwich, the founder of a company called Dunwich Borers LLC. The Blackhall and Dunwich families, the evidence suggests, have been worshipping the same entity across generations. Dunwich Borers LLC. That name means something to players of Fallout 4. In the Commonwealth, northeast of the Kingsport Lighthouse, there is a marble quarry called Dunwich Borers. It has the immediate, surface-level appearance of a raider settlement. A group called the Forged have taken it over, harvesting iron for the Saugus Ironworks. Their leader, a woman named Bedlam, leaves terminal entries that begin as ordinary status reports about production shortfalls and worker discipline before ending with a third entry that says nothing except, "I'm safe in the light," repeated over and over. As you descend into the quarry itself, the game begins doing something it does almost nowhere else. It pulls you back in time. Walking through certain sections of the dig site triggers brief, jarring hallucinations of the quarry as it appeared before the Great War. Pre-war workers, pre-war lighting, pre-war equipment, and then you snap back to the present, in the dark, surrounded by enemies. At the very bottom of the quarry, past a station where terminal entries reveal that the company's executives knew they were not running an ordinary mining operation, that there was something down there. Something they intended to retrieve. The player finds a pool of dark water. In the pool, barely submerged, is what appears to be an enormous carved stone face. Above it hangs a crane, suggesting that the whole purpose of the dig was to extract this object. Whatever it is, the Dunwich Corporation wanted it badly enough to establish a quarry over it. The flashbacks in Dunwich Borers include a vivid one in which a figure with a knife stands before a kneeling group of people bound in handcuffs. When the sequence ends and the player character snaps back to reality, the kneeling figures have become feral ghouls. The ritual preceded the bombs by an unknowable amount of time. It was already happening when the world ended. And in Fallout 76, set in Appalachia, the threads continue to unspool. Deep in a location called Lucky Hole Mine, cult rituals are evident throughout. Carved symbols on stone, bones arranged as offerings, chambers that feel deliberately constructed for a purpose that has nothing to do with mining. The cult of the Mothman, which we will come back to later in this script, appears to have splintered partly because some of its members were drawn away from the Mothman and towards something they found in the depths of this mine, something called the Interloper, which contacted them through what the holotapes describe as a kind of telepathy, pulling them deeper into the darkness. The Interloper in Lucky Hole Mine is connected to the same thread of Dunwich-adjacent horror, the cosmic entity theme, the underground location, the effect of proximity on human minds. It all rhymes. What makes Ugg-Qualtoth one of the Fallout series' most genuinely unsettling ongoing mysteries is not any single piece of evidence but the cumulative weight of all of them. The entity appears across multiple games, multiple decades of in-universe time, multiple geographic locations. Its worshippers include pre-war corporate executives and post-war cult leaders, and a father who walked away from his family one night because a warm book told him to. Its influence appears entirely consistent, regardless of what the bombs did to the rest of the world, which raises the question the game keeps asking without ever answering. Was Ugg-Qualtoth created by the war? Was it some phenomenon that existed before the war and was misinterpreted as supernatural by people who found its artifacts? Or is it something the Fallout universe is quietly insisting actually exists, an entity that predates humanity that has been here all along? That the nuclear apocalypse barely registered as an inconvenience because it was already operating on a timescale that makes human history look like an afternoon? The Fallout universe has a working explanation for almost everything. Deathclaws came from Jackson's chameleons subjected to FEV experimentation. Ghouls are humans who survived extreme radiation exposure. Supermutants are the result of FEV applied to living subjects. The game is almost aggressively scientific in its willingness to retroactively explain its monsters. Ugg-Qualtoth has no such explanation. The official game guide describes it as an alien entity. The term alien in this context is not used the way it is when describing the Zetans who appear in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta DLC. Not alien as in extraterrestrial, but alien as in incomprehensible. As in outside the categories that make sense. In Lovecraft's framework, which the series is clearly drawing from, the cosmic horror of entities like Yog-Sothoth comes from scale, from the realization that from the perspective of something old enough and vast enough, the entire history of human civilization, wars and art and science and love and grief and everything is essentially invisible, cosmically irrelevant, that there are things in existence that do not think about humanity at all, the way you do not think about the bacteria on your skin. Not malevolent, not benevolent, simply indifferent in a way that makes malevolent seem almost comforting by comparison. That is the horror the Dunwich thread is reaching for. Not that something evil is hunting you in the dark, but that something vast and entirely alien to human experience exists in the depths beneath the wasteland, and the bombs made no difference to it, and its worshippers keep finding it regardless of how many centuries pass, and there is something about proximity to it that changes a person's mind in ways they cannot reverse. Jamie, the man whose audio logs you follow into the Dunwich building, was just looking for his father. He never left. The obelisk is still down there. The carved face is still at the bottom of Dunwich Borers, waiting under the dark water. Whatever the Dunwich Corporation was trying to retrieve has not been retrieved. And the thread keeps running through the Fallout games, game after game, state after state, always pointing at the same quiet darkness underground. The question of whether any of this is real in the Fallout universe, whether Ugg-Qualtoth is a genuine supernatural entity or the product of pre-war paranoia and post-war hallucination, is one the series has, so far, chosen not to answer. And there is a strong argument that this is the right choice, because an answered Ugg-Qualtoth is just another enemy to shoot. An unanswered one is a weight you carry out of the dungeon with you, back into the sunlight, where it sits quietly in the corner of your vision and makes the familiar wasteland feel slightly less knowable than it did before. Some things are better left in the dark. Section 3. The Democracy That Devoured Itself. Vault 11. There are vaults in the Fallout universe that are simply cruel. Vault-Tec designed them as social experiments, and while the company wrapped this in the language of preparation for rebuilding civilization, the reality is that most of the vaults were traps. They were laboratories. The people who entered them were subjects, not survivors, and many of them died in ways their overseers recorded with clinical detachment. Some vaults are more disturbing than others. Vault 92 had its residents subjected to white noise experiments designed to induce violent psychosis. Vault 106 had its air supply laced with psychoactive chemicals for years. Vault 81 was designed to test cures for diseases that were introduced to the residents deliberately. Each one reveals something specific and awful about the priorities of the organization that built them. And then there is Vault 11. Vault 11, which sits west of Boulder City in the Mojave Wasteland, is a different kind of horror. It is not a horror of science misapplied or of substances introduced to unknowing subjects. It is a horror of human nature given a very specific set of circumstances and then carefully observed to see what it does with them. The setup is simple, in the way that the cruelest ideas are always simple. When the residents sealed inside Vault 11 after the bombs fell, the vault's computer informed them of the following condition. Each year, one resident must be selected and sacrificed. If the residents failed to make this selection, the vault's life support systems would be permanently shut down, killing everyone inside. The vault would enforce its requirements if they were not met voluntarily. One person per year, or everyone dies. What the residents were never told, what the vault's true design never revealed, was that this was a test of whether they would actually do it. The real trigger, the one that would open the vault door and allow the survivors to leave freely, was not compliance with the sacrifice requirement. It was the opposite. The door would open when the residents finally refused. The message would play, "You have made the decision not to sacrifice one of your own. Your commitment to human life is a shining example to us all." The mechanism to open the main vault door has now been enabled. They just had to say no. That was all. Just refuse. Instead, they held sacrifices for decades. The terminal entries you discover while exploring the empty vault in Fallout New Vegas tell the story of what those decades looked like. And it is a story about how quickly moral horror can become normalized when the structure that produces it is presented as legitimate. The residents formed voting blocks. They developed election procedures. They created a political system whose entire purpose was to decide who would be killed next. The first overseer entered the vault knowing that he would have to ask the residents to make a sacrifice. He did not know what would happen if they refused. The true purpose of the experiment was hidden from him as well. When he told the residents what was required, they were furious. They elected him as the first sacrifice. He was the one who had put them in this position. From that moment on, the role of overseer and the role of sacrifice became fused. You did not elect an overseer, you selected a victim. And then the political machinery started turning. There were 6 voting blocks, and they competed for power over the election process with the energy of factions in any small closed society. Because in a closed society like a vault, politics fills every available space. The stakes of ordinary political maneuvering influence, resources, status were exactly the same as in any human community, with one additional variable. The losing side might end up with their candidate in the sacrifice chair. The most detailed narrative the game gives you centers on a woman named Catherine Stone. Her husband Nathan was the target of political maneuvering by the most powerful bloc, the Justice Bloc, whose leader Roy Gottlieb informed Catherine that Nathan's name was being considered for the next nomination. Gottlieb offered to use his influence to protect Nathan in exchange for Catherine providing sexual favors for himself and his associates. Catherine agreed. Her husband's name was kept off the nomination list, but a later entry in the terminal records makes clear that Gottlieb went back on the arrangement regardless. Nathan was nominated and sacrificed. Catherine became the next overseer not as an honor but as part of the same grinding machinery. Her first act upon taking the position was to dissolve the election process entirely, issuing an order that moved forward by selecting the overseer at random through the vault's computer. The result was violence. The Justice Bloc, stripped of its ability to use elections as a tool of power, resorted to seizing physical control of the vault's resources: food, water, power. The final chapters of the vault's internal history are recorded in casualty lists and fragmentary notes from survivors describing the chaos. By the time it was over, 5 people were left. 5 people who sat together in a ruined vault, surrounded by the consequences of what their community had done over the course of decades, and finally made the decision that was available from the very beginning. They refused. No more sacrifices. If the machine wants to kill us for this, then let it kill us. The door opened, the message played. Vault-Tec's recorded voice offered its congratulations for the exemplary commitment to human life, with what the text can only describe as a cheerful bureaucratic sincerity that makes the whole thing even more stomach-turning. 4 of the 5 survivors could not live with what had happened. With what they had participated in, 4 of them killed themselves after leaving the vault. 1 person walked out into the Mojave and kept walking. We never find out who that person was, because Joshua Sawyer, the game director who oversaw the design of Vault 11, said they intentionally left that open. There is no closure there, just the open door and the desert. When you explore Vault 11 in the game, it has been empty for decades. The election banners are still up, decaying now but still recognizable. And here the game makes a subtle, devastating observation that is so easy to walk past if you are not paying attention. The banners do not say, "Vote for me." They say, "Vote for him. Vote for her." The political currency of Vault 11 was not self-promotion, but the ability to get someone else killed instead of you. The sacrificial chamber itself is at the end of a long hallway, and when a player character sits in the chair and triggers the presentation sequence, a cheerful slideshow called Happy Trails plays on the projector screen, while a recorded voice congratulates the current martyr for their service. The voice is warm, encouraging. It sounds like a corporate wellness program. The walls then slide open and combat robots attack. If you survive the robots, you can access the vault's mainframe and find the full recording of the automated solution response, the message that was always supposed to play when they finally refused. You can hear Vault-Tec's voice congratulating them for the commitment to human life, completely indifferent to the fact that it is being read by a visitor in an empty vault 2 centuries after the people it was addressed to are all dead. There is a coffee mug in the hallway outside the sacrificial chamber, just sitting on the floor near the entrance. It is easy to miss, but if you stop and look at it, just a mug, half full of nothing, left by the door before someone went in, it tells an entire story that the game never puts into words. Whoever left it there made it to the door and then set down something they were carrying, because they understood that where they were going, they were not going to need it. Someone walked in there carrying a cup of coffee, understanding completely what was about to happen, and went anyway. That is Vault 11. Not a story about evil people, a story about structures, about the way institutions produce compliance, the way familiarity normalizes horror, and the way the simplest available act of moral courage, just refusing, just saying no, can get buried so completely under layers of political machinery and survival calculus that an entire community can fail to take it for decades. The exit was always there. The door always would have opened. They just had to choose it. The fact that they almost did not, the fact that it took decades and a civil war and 4 suicides and 1 anonymous survivor walking alone into the desert is not a judgment of those people specifically. It is a mirror that the game holds up with a very steady hand. The Fallout universe does this again and again. It takes the abstract horrors of organized society and gives them a setting small enough to see clearly. Vault 11 makes visible what is usually too diffuse to recognize: the way we participate in systems whose full costs we deliberately avoid calculating, the way the legitimacy of a process can insulate us from responsibility for its results, the way someone can end up dead for reasons that made perfect sense to everyone involved and remain a horror that none of them were individually responsible for. 1 person walked out into the Mojave. We will never know their name. We will never know where they went, or what they built, or whether they told anyone what had happened in the vault behind them. Maybe they did. Maybe somewhere in the New California Republic's records, buried in an archive, there is a survivor account of a vault that held elections until there was no one left to vote. Or maybe they walked until the desert was all there was, and they never told anyone anything, because some things you carry alone. Section 4. The figure in the coat who is the mysterious stranger. There is a sound that regular players of the Fallout series know immediately, even if they cannot hum it on demand. A short, dry guitar riff, 2 or 3 notes descending, with a slight echo that suggests wide open spaces and no one to explain anything to you. You hear it when you are deep in a fight, when the slow-motion camera of VATS pulls back to show you a shot lined up against an enemy, and then a figure appears at the edge of your field of vision. He wears a long coat, a fedora with a darker band. He carries a .44 Magnum revolver, and he uses it with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom the act of stepping into a stranger's gunfight has become something close to routine. He fires. The enemy falls. The guitar riff plays again, slightly different, and then the figure is gone. He has been doing this since the original Fallout in 1997. He has appeared in every main entry in the series, including Fallout 76, where the game is technically set before any of the others. His name, insofar as he has a name, is the Mysterious Stranger. The Fallout 3 official game guide describes him as follows: an odd and eldritch entity said to appear and aid you in combat before you draw your dying breath. Eldritch. That is a very specific word to reach for. The Mysterious Stranger is one of those elements of the Fallout universe that exists in the borderland between game mechanic and in-universe mystery. As a game mechanic, he is straightforwardly a perk unlock it, and you get a random chance per VATS attack of summoning him to finish the job. Simple enough. But the games also treat him as real. Other characters react to him. Nick Valentine, the detective in Fallout 4, has an active case file on the Mysterious Stranger in his office. He has documented sightings across multiple regions, across multiple decades. When the stranger appears during combat while Valentine is present, Valentine expresses genuine incredulity when he sees him, and genuine frustration when he immediately vanishes. Valentine's case file contains very little useful information, because there is very little useful information to contain. The stranger appears, he fires, he vanishes. He does not linger, does not communicate, cannot be followed, and leaves no physical evidence that he was ever present. He has been doing this since at least the time of Fallout 76, which is set in 2102, 25 years after the bombs fell. By the time of Fallout 4, set in 2287, he has been operating for nearly 2 centuries. He does not appear to age. He does not appear to require food, water, or sleep in any way that any NPC has ever documented. He appears and disappears without any observable mechanism of transit. In Fallout New Vegas, the most suggestive piece of evidence about his identity appears not through the stranger himself, but through a different character entirely, a man called the Lonesome Drifter, who sits near El Dorado Gas and Service north of New Vegas with a guitar and a face that rings quiet bells if you look at it long enough. In conversation, the Drifter will describe his father in terms that, placed side by side, spell out something fairly clear. His father was mysterious. He was a stranger to his own family. He carried a gun like the one the Drifter himself carries, a unique .44 Magnum called the Mysterious Magnum, which, when drawn, plays the same guitar riff that signals the stranger's arrival. The word mysterious appears directly above the word stranger in that dialogue menu. There is a son walking around the Mojave Desert with his father's gun, and his father has apparently been wandering the wasteland for longer than any ordinary human life would permit, appearing at random moments of danger to fire a single shot and then disappear. The mysterious stranger is, in various community theories, a ghost, a time traveler, a simulation, a pre-war intelligence of some kind that was uploaded or preserved and is now executing a program whose only instruction is to intercede in life-threatening situations. Some fans have pointed to the Mark Twain story, The Mysterious Stranger, in which the title character turns out to be Satan's nephew, as a possible literary ancestor, noting that Twain's stranger also uses a .44, also operates with the casual efficiency of someone for whom human conflict is more curiosity than crisis. The Fallout 3 game guide's use of the word eldritch lands differently once you have spent time with the Dunwich building. The Fallout universe already has one thread involving entities that predate human civilization and cannot be fully comprehended by it. The mysterious stranger may or may not be related to that thread, but the language the game uses when talking about him is, at minimum, reaching for the same register of strangeness. He is not supernatural in any menacing sense. He saves lives. He asks nothing in return. He exists in the wasteland the way certain questions exist in certain minds persistently, without answering themselves. A presence that changes the texture of everything around it without ever explaining what it is. In Fallout 4, something has changed. The stranger is middle-aged now, where before he seemed ageless. His coat is buttoned differently. The piano notes that signal his appearance have replaced the guitar riff. Nick Valentine's files confirm he has been cited in both the Capital Wasteland Fallout 3's setting and the Commonwealth Fallout 4's setting. Nick knows there is something genuinely strange here. He has looked at the timeline and the geography and the physical impossibility of the same man in the same coat appearing and disappearing in firefights across 200 years of wasteland history. And his detective's mind keeps arriving at the same unsatisfying conclusion. The evidence points at something, but the something makes no sense. That is where the mystery lives. The mysterious stranger is one of the Fallout series' most elegant ongoing puzzles because it exists in exactly the right register of ambiguity. He is clearly not ordinary. He is clearly significant. The game keeps returning to him, keeps leaving breadcrumbs, keeps planting small details that accumulate without resolving. He has a son with his gun and his walk. He has a detective who cannot close the case. He has appeared before players were born and will apparently appear after they have forgotten his name. If there is an answer, it has not been given yet. Perhaps the designers of the original game knew who he was and chose not to tell anyone. Perhaps he was always intended as a mystery that never gets solved because some mysteries are more useful unsolved. Perhaps Tim Kaine will sit down for another interview one day and mention, with the quiet surprise of a man who assumed everyone already knew, that the stranger is simply this or simply that. Until then, the guitar riff plays, and he appears at the edge of the frame, and he fires one shot, and the question of who he is floats in the air of the wasteland like cigarette smoke in a room no one has entered in a very long time. Some figures are more interesting for being unknowable. The wasteland has its monsters, its factions, its power struggles, and its political philosophies. It also has this: a man in a coat who appears when you are dying and keeps you alive for reasons he has never once chosen to explain. That is its own kind of answer, even if it does not feel like one. Section 5. The man who fell into the Grand Canyon and got back up. Joshua Graham and the questions he carries. There is a character in Fallout New Vegas who exists in the main game only as a myth. You hear his name, or rather, the name people are not supposed to say through fragments of dialogue. Members of Caesar's Legion do not speak of him directly. They refer to him as the Burned Man, in the way you refer to something dangerous by a description rather than a title. Civilian travelers in the Mojave have heard the stories. Everyone has heard the stories. A man whose execution became a legend precisely because it did not work. His name is Joshua Graham, and meeting him in the Honest Hearts DLC is one of the most quietly devastating character experiences the Fallout series has ever produced. The outline of the story is straightforward enough to summarize in a few sentences and then spend hours thinking about. Joshua Graham was born in New Canaan, a Mormon settlement in what had been Ogden, Utah. He was intelligent, gifted with languages, trained as a missionary. In 2247, he accompanied a followers of the Apocalypse expedition to the Grand Canyon to study tribal dialects, and in the course of that expedition, he met a man named Edward Sallow, who would become Caesar. The two of them, together, built something. They took a small, desperate tribe called the Blackfoots, who had been losing a conflict against 7 other groups and were willing to try anything, and turned them into the nucleus of what would become Caesar's Legion. Graham had the language skills and the cross-cultural understanding. Sallow, drawing on whatever pre-war texts he had access to, had the Roman framework he intended to impose. Between them, they transformed fractured tribal warfare into the beginnings of an organized military civilization. Graham became Caesar's first legate. The Malpais Legate name comes from the Spanish for Badland, the volcanic wasteland terrain of the Southwest. He was the military commander of the Legion, and over the following decades he was instrumental in every conquest that brought the Legion from a single tribe to a regional power stretching across the former American Southwest. The things he did in service of that expansion were, by most reasonable moral calculations, terrible. Caesar's legion does not concern itself with the well-being of the people it conquers. It enslaves women and kills men it cannot use, and destroys the cultures it encounters as a matter of policy. Graham participated in all of this. He was, for 30 years, the person who made the conquests possible. And then came the First Battle of Hoover Dam. The NCR, the New California Republic, the wasteland's most organized attempt at democratic governance, had been building toward a confrontation with the Legion for years. At Hoover Dam, in 2277, the two forces met in a battle that determined the balance of power in the Mojave for the foreseeable future. Caesar's legion lost. Not completely, not catastrophically in terms of lives, but enough. The NCR held the dam. The legion retreated. Joshua Graham returned to Caesar in shame. What Caesar did next was both an act of political theater and a genuine expression of the ruthlessness on which his authority rested. He had Graham covered in pitch, in tar, and set on fire. Then he threw him into the Grand Canyon. The message was unambiguous. Failure at the highest levels of the Legion is not forgiven, not even by a man who helped build everything you have. The rule is absolute or it is nothing. And then Joshua Graham survived. He woke at the base of the canyon, burned across his entire body, broken in ways that should have been fatal. Members of the Legion who were sent to confirm his death came back silent or did not come back at all. Rumors spread. Caesar forbade anyone from speaking Graham's name, which only made the legend larger. The burned man became a story that the Legion told itself as a warning, and that tribal peoples across the region told as something closer to a ghost story. After 3 months of traveling in constant pain, immune to most medications, which meant every day of that journey was experienced in full, Graham reached New Canaan. His people received him. They did not shun him for what he had become or what he had done. They welcomed him as someone who had been lost and found his way back. That moment is, for many players, the emotional center of Honest Hearts. Because what Graham carries into Zion, where the DLC takes place, is not just the physical reality of his injuries, which require him to change his bandages every day in a process he describes as painful as being set on fire again. He carries the full weight of his own choices. He does not distribute the blame across Caesar, or the circumstances of the wasteland, or the logic of war. He made the choices he made because he chose to make them. No one forced him. He understands this in the way that only someone who has had a very long time to think about it can understand it. His faith is the most interesting element of his characterization. Joshua Graham is a Mormon, and he believes genuinely. The way the dialogue makes clear is not simply socially habitual, but is the actual working substance of his interior life. He has been baptized twice in his own description, once in water and once in fire. He survived the second baptism and continues to function as a missionary and as a protector of the tribes in Zion. But his faith is complicated in ways the game refuses to smooth over. He wants revenge. He names the wanting directly, with a clarity that is almost startling in a character who is otherwise so carefully measured. He wants revenge against Caesar, and he wants to call it God's justice to justify the things he has done. He is aware of the difference between genuine divine purpose and his own desire to be righteous in his violence. He is not always sure which one he is serving. That uncertainty is what makes him a character rather than a symbol. When you ask him how he survived the Grand Canyon, he says, "I survived because the fire inside burned brighter than the fire around me. I fell down into that dark chasm, but the flame burned on and on." Then he pauses and clarifies, unprompted, that the fire inside him was not rage. It was faith. It was, he suggests, something he did not manufacture and could not have sustained alone. This is the mystery the character poses to the player. Is Joshua Graham alive because of faith? Is his survival evidence of something larger than survival instinct and fortunate circumstance? The game does not answer this. It presents the question through a man who is genuinely uncertain about it himself, who alternates between profound conviction and the private knowledge that he has used his faith as camouflage for impulses that faith should have disciplined. The ending of Honest Hearts depends on choices you make, and those choices push Graham toward different resolutions. In the version where he is allowed to destroy the White Legs utterly, the tribe that destroyed New Canaan, he becomes something uncomfortably close to what the Malpais Legate was, a man using righteous language to accomplish extermination. In the version where he spares the enemy war chief, He does something that looks like mercy but costs him enormously, and the game's ending slides describe him living out his days in Zion, leading the Dead Horses tribe, carrying the weight of everything in a body that is in constant pain, choosing the harder path because the harder path is the one that preserves his humanity. He remains, in either version, deeply uncomfortable to be around in the best possible way. His dialogue is full of lines that land with the weight of genuine theological inquiry. The line most associated with him, "We can't expect God to do all the work," has accumulated an unlikely cultural resonance outside the game, circulated by players who are not religious, and who find in it something more broadly applicable than its original context. Which brings us to the question the character raises that no amount of in-game lore resolves. What did keep Joshua Graham alive? Is there a God in the Fallout universe? Is there something that watches over certain people for reasons that are not legible through the logic of physics and biology? The game presents this question through a man who was lit on fire and thrown into a canyon and walked out 3 months later, and it has the genuine intelligence to refuse to answer it. The Wasteland is not a place that offers easy comfort on spiritual questions. Its gods, if it has gods, are as ambiguous as everything else. What it offers instead is people, complicated, broken, trying, sometimes magnificent, sometimes monstrous, carrying their wounds in whatever way allows them to keep moving. Joshua Graham keeps moving. That is the answer the game provides. Whether it is faith or stubbornness or something the game will not name, he keeps moving through the desert in his bandages, changing them every day because it is better to be clean than comfortable, and leading a tribe of people who need someone to be the thing that a burned man crawling out of a canyon on sheer will can teach you to be. Something about how the worst thing that can happen to you does not have to be the last thing. Section 6. The Sierra Madre and the city that cannot let go dead money and its ghosts. There is a casino in the Fallout universe that was never opened. That is where this story starts, and also, in a sense, where it ends. The Sierra Madre Casino and Resort was built in the years immediately before the Great War by a man named Frederick Sinclair, who intended it to be the most opulent private gambling establishment in the American West. Invitations to its grand opening gala, scheduled for late October 2077, were currency among the powerful. A ticket was evidence that you mattered. The world's most famous entertainers were lined up to perform. The engineering was state-of-the-art, sourced from Big MT, the technology think tank that appears in the Old World Blues DLC as a monument to pre-war science's willingness to pursue any idea regardless of consequences. The bombs fell before the opening night. The 23rd of October 2077, the same day the Great War ended, everything else also ended, whatever the Sierra Madre was supposed to become. The casino froze in place. Its experimental security systems locked it down. Its cutting-edge air conditioning and climate control, which had been field testing technology developed at Big MT, malfunctioned. What emerged from those vents was not conditioned air. It was the cloud. The cloud is a reddish, chemically toxic fog that has surrounded the Sierra Madre for 200 years. It eats metal. It eats organic material. It has turned the city around the casino into one of the most hostile environments in the entire Fallout setting. The human guests who were trapped inside the casino when the lockdown engaged, wearing experimental hazmat suits that were supposed to protect them, underwent a slow and terrible transformation over the following decades that turned them into the ghost people, humanoid creatures encased in the suits that have fused to their bodies, unable to be killed cleanly by most conventional weapons, patient and silent and wrong in ways that take a moment to articulate. The Sierra Madre became a legend. Stories circulated through wasteland camps and saloons about a casino full of pre-war wealth, preserved by the cloud that protected it, waiting for someone clever enough or desperate enough to reach it. A broadcast signal played on loop, transmitting a fragment of a song that drew treasure hunters from across the Mojave like moths. Most of them died trying to reach it. The cloud, the ghost people, the city's automated security, the Sierra Madre defends itself with the efficiency of something that was designed to keep people out. One person had gotten close. Father Elijah, formerly a Brotherhood of Steel elder who had lost most of his chapter at the Battle of Helios I and spiraled into an obsession with the technology he could not reach, had spent years studying the Sierra Madre from a distance. He could not crack it alone. He needed people, and people in a world full of desperate survivors, were something you could acquire if you were willing to do terrible things. His method was to lure treasure hunters using the casino's broadcast signal, intercept them at a Brotherhood of Steel bunker he had commandeered, fit them with explosive collars, and force them to serve as his tools. The collars were wired to his remote control and would detonate if their wearers strayed too far from him, damaged their communication equipment, or were simply decided to be expendable. A parade of unlucky scavengers moved through this system and died, replaced by the next wave attracted by the same broadcast. The Courier the Player character is the latest in this series. Waking up in the city with a collar around their neck and Elijah's voice in their ear, they must navigate the Sierra Madre with 3 other conscripted companions: Dean Domino, a ghoulified lounge singer who has been trapped at the casino since before the bombs fell; a woman named Christine whose voice box was replaced by an autodoc, leaving her mute; and a nightkin called Dog who contains a second, more stable personality named God. Each of these characters is defined by what they cannot let go of. Dean Domino has been waiting for 200 years to rob the casino's vault, driven by a jealousy of Sinclair that predates the war. Christine's entire purpose is to track down and kill Elijah, the man who mutilated her, regardless of what it costs her. Dog is trapped in a body with a mind that hates him. Elijah himself has built his entire remaining life around reaching a vault that he needs other people to open for him, a vault he cannot reach without help, the last piece of a plan to cleanse the Mojave with the cloud and rule whatever is left. The Sierra Madre is a game about obsession, about the things we carry that we cannot set down even when they are killing us, about the way old grievances and old desires can calcify into something that looks like purpose from the outside but feels, from the inside, like a hand around your throat. The Dead Money DLC's central theme is stated quietly but clearly in the framing Elijah provides at the beginning. Getting to it, that's not the hard part. It's letting go. The vault itself, when you finally reach it, is anticlimactic in the most deliberately designed way. It is full of gold bars that are too heavy to carry. They weigh 35 pounds each, and you can only take a handful before your carrying capacity collapses. The Sierra Madre chips that are used as currency throughout the DLC are worth nothing outside the casino. The vending machines that manufacture supplies are uniquely tied to this location. Everything inside the Sierra Madre is wealth that only functions inside the Sierra Madre. Get it out, and it is just weight. The metaphor is the kind that should feel heavy-handed and somehow does not. Frederick Sinclair himself is one of the unresolved mysteries at the center of Dead Money. His terminal entries, scattered through the casino, reveal a man who started the project as a monument to pre-war wealth and excess and discovered, over the course of building it, that he was in love with a woman named Vera Keyes. Vera was a performer, and her relationship with Sinclair was complicated by Dean Domino, who had recruited her to help him rob the vault by seducing Sinclair while Domino obtained the necessary codes. Vera was blackmailed into the scheme. Her letters to Sinclair suggest she came to genuinely care for him regardless, and that caring made the deception harder to maintain. Sinclair, for his part, built the Sierra Madre as his offering to a world that had stopped making sense to him, and then built the vault beneath it as his final gift to Vera, a shelter that could sustain 2 people indefinitely if they made it there before the bombs fell. He wanted to survive the war with her. The bombs fell. She did not make it to the vault. Nobody did. Sinclair's body is in the vault, waiting beside the mechanism that never got triggered, beside supplies meant for 2 that were never used. Whether Vera was trying to warn him at the end, whether she made any attempt to reach the vault herself, whether she tried to contact him or simply died in the chaos with everyone else, the game does not tell us. What it leaves is the architecture of Sinclair's love for her written into the engineering of the place. A vault designed to last forever, stocked for 2, locked with her voice as the key, in a casino surrounded by killing fog, waiting 200 years for people who are never coming. The Sierra Madre is a ghost story about what does not end when people do. About how the structures we build around our desires persist after we are gone, still running, still expecting a future that was canceled on a specific date in October 2077. The security holograms do not know the war happened. The ghost people have forgotten they were ever anything else. The vault machines are still stocked. The broadcast is still playing. The only question the casino cannot stop asking is the one Elijah provides and then fails to answer: can you let go? For most of the people who arrive at the Sierra Madre, the answer is no. That is the whole point. The broadcast calls to people who cannot let go of wealth, of revenge, of a dead world's promise. It pulls them through the cloud and through the ghost people and through each other, and almost all of them die there, leaving behind bones and old ambitions in a city that was built for a celebration that never happened. But the player can leave. The player can walk out of the Sierra Madre carrying only what they can hold, and the game's central mechanic makes that carrying capacity literal. You have to leave the gold behind. You can leave with useful supplies, with knowledge, with the ability to manufacture things that will help you in the Mojave, but not with everything, not with the weight of the place itself. That is the ending the DLC rewards with the most dignity, taking what is genuinely useful and walking away from the rest. It is easier to describe than to do. Most of us in our own versions of the Sierra Madre know that. Section 7. Wings in the Dark, the Mothman of Appalachia, and what it might mean. Before the Fallout series arrived in West Virginia, the Mothman was already there. The real legend of the Mothman is rooted in the Point Pleasant area of West Virginia in the mid-1960s, where a series of sightings of a large, winged, red-eyed humanoid creature preceded one of the area's worst disasters. The collapse of the Silver Bridge in December 1967, which killed 46 people. Eyewitness reports described the creature as bipedal and enormous, with wingspan estimates that made birds seem inadequate as a comparison. Over time, the Mothman became associated in the public imagination with disaster, with the idea that its appearance was a harbinger of something terrible about to happen. Whether the Mothman is a warning or a cause, a supernatural entity or a misidentified animal or a mass psychological event, has been debated by everyone from cryptozoology enthusiasts to academic folklorists. The creature has its own museum in Point Pleasant. It has an annual festival. It has become one of the most culturally embedded cryptids in American folklore, inseparable from a specific geographic region and a specific kind of Appalachian unease about the things that happen in the dark spaces of those mountains. When Fallout 76 chose Appalachia as its setting, the Mothman was always going to be part of the picture. The question was what kind of Mothman? The answer turned out to be several kinds simultaneously, and the ambiguity between them is where the mystery lives. In the world of Fallout 76, the Mothman existed as a legend before the bombs fell. The Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, a real institution that exists in our world, appears in the game as a location, still housing its collection of Mothman memorabilia. A cult had formed around the creature, the Cult of the Mothman, a secretive group that worshipped the Mothman as a divine being before the Great War. As the war approached, and the threat of nuclear annihilation became increasingly real, the cult attempted to summon the Mothman for protection and guidance. According to the game's lore, the summoning succeeded on the 22nd of October 2077, the day before the bombs fell. A cult member named Brother Charles received a vision that he interpreted as a warning of floods. The faithful gathered on rooftops to await the flood. The flood came in the form of nuclear fallout. The cult survived. They sheltered in Lucky Hole Mine during the worst of it, and their numbers persisted into the post-war wasteland. What the game introduces that the legend does not have is the existence of actual Mothmen, large, mutated, moth-like creatures that have settled across Appalachia. Most of them are animal-level intelligence, clearly descended from pre-war moths mutated by radiation into something far larger and stranger. They spawn at night and only at night. They observe human settlements from distances, watching with their glowing eyes, and will flee rather than engage unless provoked. There is something in their behavior that feels less like predation and more like surveillance. And then there is the Wise Mothman. The Wise Mothman is a specific, apparently unique creature with purple eyes encountered through a questline at the Landview Lighthouse. To summon it, a player must gather bioluminescent fluid from fireflies and radodes in the area and deposit it into the lighthouse lamp. The Wise Mothman appears at the base of the lighthouse, does not attack, and grants the player character a small experience bonus before departing. The Cult of the Mothman, which has fragmented into multiple sects by the time of the game's events, regards the Wise Mothman as the original entity, the divine being, while the standard Mothmen are understood as descended from it. There is a sect within the Cult of the Mothman called the Enlightened, who revere the Wise Mothman specifically. There is another faction, sometimes called the Dim Ones, who worship the red-eyed standard variety. And then there is a third group who have gone somewhere else entirely. The fracture within the Mothman cult traces back to Lucky Hole Mine, where a cult member named Jeff Lane began hearing something different from the Mothman. His holotapes, scattered through Point Pleasant and the mine, describe a growing awareness of something that felt distinct from his worship of the Mothman, something that contacted him and others through a kind of internal experience he describes as telepathy, pulling them deeper into the mine, asking them to go further down into the darkness. Lane came to understand himself as a vessel. For what, he does not say directly. The entity that contacted him is called the Interloper. The Interloper's presence in Lucky Hole Mine connects, as keen lore explorers have noted, to the ongoing Dunwich thread. The mine has the same qualities as the Dunwich Building and Dunwich Borers, the sense of something very old occupying a physical space underground, drawing human minds toward it, transforming the people who get too close. Whether the Interloper is Ugg-Qualtoth, or a related entity, or something else entirely operating on the same register, the game leaves unclear. The Fallout, the role-playing GameCore rulebook, describes Ugg-Qualtoth as having a following in Appalachia, making a pilgrimage toward the Dunwich Borers Quarry in Massachusetts. The threads are connected, even if the exact nature of the connection is deliberately obscured. What makes the Mothman mystery particularly interesting as a piece of sustained world-building is the way it holds multiple possible interpretations in parallel, without forcing a resolution. Is the Mothman a genuine supernatural entity, a divine herald whose appearances signal genuine cosmic significance? Or is it a large, mutated insect that radiation turned into something impressively strange, which a cult then projected its theology onto? The game presents both possibilities with equal seriousness. The answer that the in-game lore seems to lean toward, though never commits to, is that the wise Mothman is genuinely unusual in ways that exceed the ordinary explanation for mutated wildlife. The experience bonus it grants is presented in the game's logic as a real effect, not a placebo. The cult members who received genuine warnings on the day before the bombs fell, whatever that communication actually was, responded to it in ways that saved their lives. The Mothman watched the human settlements of Appalachia both before the war and for the 2 centuries after it, which suggests either a very long-lived individual creature or a continuity of observation that implies purpose. Whether purpose implies a mind, and whether a mind implies the kind of consciousness that makes the question of what the Mothman is a meaningful one rather than just a zoological inquiry, is where the mystery opens up into genuine philosophical territory. The Fallout series has always been interested in what makes something a person rather than a machine, what makes a mind rather than a process. The synths of Fallout 4 are the most direct expression of that interest, but the Mothman question runs in the same channel. Is there something it is like to be the wise Mothman? Is the attention it pays to human settlements something that looks like care from the outside because it is care, or because we are very good at seeing care where we want to see it? The cult of the Mothman does not have a satisfying answer to this, because cults never do. They have fervor and practice and an interior logic that makes complete sense from within and looks like something else entirely from without. The Enlightened's vision of the wise Mothman as a gentle guide is neither provable nor disprovable given the available evidence. The dim one's worship of the red-eyed standard variety as something demanding and dangerous is also neither provable nor disprovable. The Interloper faction's abandonment of the Mothman entirely in favor of whatever they found in Lucky Hole Mine is the darkest branch of the tree, and the one that rhymes most clearly with the Dunwich horror running through the rest of the series. What the Mothman of Appalachia gives the Fallout universe is something unusual, a mystery that is locally grounded in real folklore, that treats its source material with genuine respect rather than simple reference, and that uses the specific character of West Virginia's cryptid tradition to ask questions about faith and transformation and what it means to seek something in the dark. The people who formed the cult of the Mothman before the war were, by most conventional measures, eccentric. They worshipped a creature most people thought was a fiction. They performed rituals that their neighbors presumably found somewhere between amusing and alarming. And then the 23rd of October, 2077 happened, and they were on the rooftops and in the mine and alive, when almost everyone else was dead. What do you do with that? What does that do to a belief system? What does it do to the shape of faith when the thing you were worshipping turns out to have been right about something? Fallout 76 does not offer a resolution to this. It offers, instead, a fractured community still working out what happened and what it meant. 2 centuries later, in a world where the old certainties are gone and the new ones are still forming, the Mothman watches from the edges of the forests. Its eyes glow in the dark. It was there before the bombs. It is here after them. What it means is still being decided. Section 8. The question of whether a copy is a person, the Institute, and its synths. There is a faction in Fallout 4 that operates entirely underground, beneath the ruins of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known in the wasteland as the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, or simply CIT. This faction is called the Institute, and for most of the game's first act, before you ever step inside their facility, they function as the resident horror story of the Commonwealth. Parents warn children. Settlers fortify their settlements against them. The common wisdom about the Institute is that they replace people that you could be living next to your neighbor for years and never know that the real person vanished one night, and what came back was a machine wearing their face. This is the Broken Mask incident, which happened in 2229, and it is the event that defined the Institute's relationship with the Commonwealth for the following 60 years. A third-generation synth designated as an infiltration unit experienced what the Institute's records call a malfunction and went on a shooting rampage in Diamond City before being brought down and revealed to be a synthetic being. The people of Diamond City and, by extension, the Commonwealth had feared the Institute before. After the Broken Mask, they feared synths. The two fears fused and have never fully separated. What makes the Institute one of the Fallout series' most genuinely morally complicated factions is not their methods, which are clearly terrible, but their goals, which are not entirely wrong and are never entirely explained. The Institute's motto is mankind redefined. Their scientists speak about the betterment of humanity with the earnestness of people who actually believe it, not as rhetorical cover but as a genuine article of faith. When you finally enter the Institute and meet its members, you discover that many of them are not monsters. They are researchers, educators, people who have devoted their careers to questions they find genuinely important, who live in a clean, well-lit facility with food and medicine and music, and the kind of intellectual community that the surface world barely has the resources to imagine. They also have slaves. The Generation 3 synths, the ones that are physically indistinguishable from humans, manufactured from lab-grown biological tissue with a single neural implant that allows the Institute to program and control them are, by any reasonable moral definition, people. They think. They feel. They can be traumatized. They can form attachments. They can dream. They can, as the Railroad demonstrates, be given new memories and new identities and live full human lives if they escape their creators. The Institute does not acknowledge any of this. To the Institute, synths are products, property, tools. The synth program began humbly enough. The first-generation synths were mechanical constructions, skeletal and unmistakably robotic, built in the 2170s when the Institute needed workers who could operate on the surface without the radiation vulnerabilities of biological humans. They were machines in the way that the pre-war robots populating the wasteland are machines capable, functional, not even close to people. By the early 200 seconds, the push toward increasingly biological design was already underway. The goal was what the Institute called perfect synthetic organics, a synthetic being that could operate in the surface world as an undetectable agent, gather information, influence events, and return. The research was ethically compromised from its earliest phases. Achieving the biological complexity required meant using FEV on abducted Commonwealth residents, experimenting on living people without consent, studying the mutations, and discarding the subjects. The breakthrough came not from biology but from genetics. In 2227, Kellogg, a mercenary the Institute had employed for years because he had cybernetic enhancements that slowed his aging, retrieved an infant from Vault 111. The infant's DNA was pristine, untouched by radiation, preserved by cryogenic sleep since before the war. That infant was Sean, and his genetic code became the foundation of every third-generation synth the Institute subsequently manufactured. Sean grew up inside the Institute. He became a scientist, then the director. He designed the synths that carry his own DNA as their biological baseline. He sent Kellogg to retrieve his own parents from cryo, presumably out of some combination of curiosity and longing that he never adequately explained, and set in motion the events of Fallout 4's main storyline. The question of what the Institute is actually trying to achieve, what Mankind Redefined means in practical terms, is one the game raises repeatedly and never fully answers. Individual Institute scientists will tell you the surface world is too far gone to save, and that the underground is the only viable continuation of human civilization. The logic is self-serving in ways that some of them seem aware of and many of them do not. They have the food and the technology and the security to help the Commonwealth significantly, and they choose not to, partly because of the genuine breakdown in relations after decades of kidnapping and experimentation, and partly because of an institutional culture that has pathologized the surface world as irredeemably contaminated. This is the mystery the Institute represents. How does a community of people, most of whom are not individually evil, build and maintain a practice that is collectively monstrous? How does good science and genuine intellectual curiosity, and even real care for human welfare, coexist with slavery and kidnapping and the systematic terror of an entire region? The answer the game offers, through the Institute's history and through the conversations available with its members, is something like institutional momentum. Once the initial compromises were made, once the decision was made to experiment on surface people because they were easier to obtain than volunteers, once the decision was made to treat synths as property rather than people, because acknowledging their personhood would have been inconvenient, each subsequent compromise built on the previous one. No single person made the decision to make the Institute what it is. It accumulated, slowly, over decades, the way most institutional evils accumulate. The synths themselves are the purest version of this question. When Paladin Danse of the Brotherhood of Steel turns out to be a synth, a fact that surprises him more than anyone, because he never knew the game asks you directly, does this change what he is? Does the fact that his memories were manufactured and his body was grown in a laboratory mean that everything he experienced, everything he worked for, everything he cared about is somehow less real? He does not know the answer. You do not know the answer. The Brotherhood of Steel has an answer: they want him dead, but the brutality of their certainty suggests they are afraid of what the question implies. The Railroad has an answer too. Synths are people. They deserve freedom. Every one of them is worth risking lives to save. This is admirable, and the game presents it as such, while also suggesting that the Railroad's single-minded focus on individual synth rescue leaves the structural problem, the Institute itself, unaddressed. The Institute has an answer. Synths are tools, and any emotional response you have to them is a consequence of how well the engineering worked. None of these answers is complete. None of them is sufficient for the question. Generation 3 synths do not age. Their children do not mature. They are addicted to fancy lad snack cakes, which is a detail so specific and strange that it lives in the memory long after most of the game's other details have faded. They cannot gain weight. They require sleep and food and air to survive. They can be identified only through autopsy. The only thing separating a Gen 3 synth from a human being by the end of the Institute's program is a single neural implant and the circumstances of their creation. The question of whether those circumstances are morally relevant, whether a being that experiences consciousness, forms memories, feels pain, loves people, has ambitions, and can be traumatized, is less of a person because their skull was manufactured, is the question at the heart of the Institute story. The Fallout series, characteristically, refuses to answer it definitively. It presents the evidence, shows you the living, breathing synths who insist on their own humanity, shows you the clinical facility where they are produced, and then lets you decide which faction's answer most resembles your own. The Institute is ultimately destroyed in every ending except the one where you lead it yourself. Even in the ending where you take over and become the new director, the game's available options do not include making peace between the Institute and the surface world in any sustainable way. The damage runs too deep. The fear is too old. What the Institute leaves behind in every ending is the question. Everywhere in the Commonwealth, there are people who do not know whether they are people in the way they think they are, and the possibility cannot be disproved, and the inability to disprove it has become the texture of everyday fear in a region that already had plenty of other things to be afraid of. The synth component, the small piece of technology found when a Gen 3 synth is killed, is never explained in the game. What it does exactly is left unstated. It is presumably the neural implant, the one thing that makes a synth different from a human, small enough to hold in one hand. The entire philosophical weight of the question, sitting in an inventory slot, labeled Synth Component, undescribed. That is the Institute mystery in miniature. What is this? Is there a person inside it? What happens to them now? Section 9. The smaller lights scattered mysteries across the wasteland. The Fallout universe is large enough that some of its most interesting mysteries live in its margins in side quests that most players skip, in terminal entries that require patience to find, in the behavior of creatures and NPCs that suggest things the game never explains aloud. These smaller mysteries do not have the philosophical weight of the Institute question or the cosmic strangeness of Ugg-Queltoth, but they have a particular quality of quiet wonder that feels appropriate to a world built from the remains of another one. Consider the mannequins of the Commonwealth in Fallout 4. They appear throughout the game, posed in shop windows and buildings, displaying pre-war fashions in the patient way that mannequins do. This is expected. What is not expected is the accumulating evidence that they move. Not when you are watching. But in the ruins of certain buildings, mannequins are found arranged in tableaux that suggest deliberate positioning grouped around a television, seated at a table, posed in doorways, as if watching a visitor's approach. A mannequin that was in one position when you entered a building will, on occasion, be in a different position when you leave. No enemy has spawned. Nothing appears different except the position of a plastic figure that was not there before. The game offers no explanation for this. There is no quest attached to it, no NPC ever comments on it. It is simply one of those details that the Commonwealth holds, folded into its atmosphere of barely contained wrongness that you notice when you are paying attention, and that stays with you. There is the matter of the children of the atom in Far Harbor, who worship radioactive contamination as a holy substance. Their theology is elaborate and internally coherent. Radiation destroys the old and enables the new. The atom is the source of both destruction and creation, and the dividing of the atom mirrors the dividing of the world that their faith promises will come. Far Harbor's version of the Children of the Atom has access to a nuclear submarine, a source of extraordinary technological power, and their High Confessor Tectus is driving toward a kind of apocalyptic conclusion, a final division that would irradiate the entire island. What Far Harbor introduces that is genuinely strange is the Mother of the Fog. During a vision quest required to advance the quest line, a player character sees her, a spectral figure, appearing and disappearing in the fog, guiding them toward a shrine. She is described in the cult's records as a divine being associated with the island itself, with the fog that covers it, with the transformation that the children of the atom believe is coming. Whether she is a hallucination, a genuine supernatural presence, or something technological, a hologram perhaps, or a product of whatever physics the island's particular radiation environment produces, the game does not say. She is one of several figures in the Fallout universe who occupy the uneasy space between certainly real and certainly imagined, where the evidence for both interpretations is carefully balanced. Then there is Mama Murphy, who appears early in Fallout 4 as an old woman with a chem addiction who claims to have the ability to see things she should not be able to see. The conventional explanation is that she is simply hallucinating from her heavy chem use, and the game presents this possibility with genuine plausibility. But her specific predictions are accurate in ways that extend beyond what hallucination should be able to achieve. She describes the sole survivor's son before she has any possible way to know about him. She describes the Prydwen before it appears over the Commonwealth. She describes things that happen. Community theories about Mama Murphy have proposed that she was a former Institute employee with access to information about the Commonwealth's future. Others have suggested she has a synth component of her own, one that functions differently from the standard infiltrator model and provides her with predictive data from some source. Others argue she genuinely has the sight and leave the question of what that means for the physics of the Fallout universe uncomfortably open. The game killed her off, probably, because letting her keep prophesying would require constantly addressing what she knows. But the question of what she was drawing on when she told you things that were true before they happened is one the game quietly leaves without resolution. There is Nick Valentine's filing cabinet. Nick Valentine is a detective in Diamond City, a pre-war detective's memories implanted in a Generation 2 synth body, carrying forward a personality and a set of memories that belong to a man who died before the war. He has the original Nick's memories up to a certain point, and then nothing, and then the present. He has been navigating the space between those two selves for however long he has been operational, and his philosophical equanimity about the situation is one of the more gently moving things in Fallout 4. In his office, underneath his cot, is a filing cabinet. Inside the filing cabinet is a case file on the mysterious stranger. It contains descriptions of sightings, dates, locations, physical description consistent across all sightings, and a note from Nick to himself that says, essentially, I cannot explain this. I have tried, I keep trying, something about this is wrong in a way I can't locate. A detective whose job is to find answers, who has spent what appears to be years keeping a case file on the one problem he cannot solve, because the evidence keeps accumulating, and the conclusion it points to is impossible, and he is unwilling to write impossible in the file. That is Nick Valentine in miniature. That is also, in its way, the Fallout series in miniature. There is the mystery of Mr. New Vegas, the personable AI disc jockey who hosts Radio New Vegas, speaking warmly and helpfully to the Wasteland's listeners in a voice that feels like pre-war radio at its most aspirational. Most players encounter him as background noise, the soundtrack to driving across the Mojave. What most players do not realize is that he is not a human DJ or even a recording. He is an artificial intelligence designed before the Great War to entertain, apparently running continuously for 200 years on some server infrastructure that the bombs did not destroy. He knows no context for his existence. He describes local events with the neutral positivity of a professional radio host, completely unaware of the full horror of what has happened to the world he is broadcasting into. Whether Mr. New Vegas knows he is an AI is unclear. Whether he knows the war happened is unclear. He continues, warm and professional, in the way that automated systems continue, because no one has turned him off, and because the parameters of his function do not include stopping. There is the mystery of what is happening in Flagstaff, the capital of Caesar's Legion, where Caesar himself lives when he is not at the fort. New Vegas tells you that Caesar has spent decades trying to recreate Roman civilization in the wasteland, and the political philosophy that emerges from the Legion's expansion is genuinely Roman in certain respects, not the sanitized version of Rome that popular culture tends to favor, but something close to the actual republic becoming empire dynamics that the historical record describes. But we never see Flagstaff. We never see the capital. We do not know if what Caesar has built there actually resembles his vision, or whether the vision was always more ideology than practice, a story the Legion tells itself about what it is while doing what it does. There is the mystery of the Kings in New Vegas, the faction built around impersonating a singing icon whose name they do not use. The Kings are modeled entirely around a specific style of performance, dress, and speech that is unmistakably Elvis Presley without ever acknowledging the name. Their leader, the King, found a holotape and a costume, and built an identity around them that spread to an entire neighborhood. The Kings do not know who their idol was. They have preserved the mannerisms and the presentation while entirely losing the origin, and the result is something that feels simultaneously like devotion and like a game of telephone that has been running long enough to forget the original phrase. There is the mystery of what Harold was. Harold appears in multiple Fallout games, a mutant with a tree growing from his head, wandering the wasteland with a specific kind of weary philosophical humility that comes from having been strange for a very long time. Tim Kaine admitted in his 2025 interview that the development team never had a consensus on what Harold was, genetically or ontologically. Kaine himself leaned toward Harold being some kind of ghoul. Others on the team thought he was something different. He simply existed as one of those entities the series accumulated over time without fully accounting for. And the tree growing from his head, Bob, as Harold calls it, because it has its own consciousness and its own feelings about things, is never explained in a way that the existing science of the Fallout universe can accommodate. Harold is a mystery because he predates the need for him to make sense. He was there at the beginning, when the series was smaller and less systematized, when it was still making up its rules. In a universe that has since built elaborate scaffolding around mutation and FEV and the specific effects of radiation exposure, Harold remains an artifact of an earlier creative moment, gently inexplicable, comfortable with being inexplicable, happy to sit by his tree and wait for someone to come along and talk. That quality, the willingness to sit with inexplicability, to carry it without forcing it into a shape it does not fit, is one of the things the best Fallout lore does. Harold's tree grows. The mysterious stranger appears and disappears. The obelisk waits in the dark. Mr. New Vegas describes the weather. And the wasteland keeps accumulating its mysteries the way ruins accumulate weather slowly, patiently, without asking anyone's permission. Expanded Section 1 Addendum. The architecture of a world that built its own ending. To fully appreciate the mystery of who dropped the first bombs, it helps to spend a moment with the world that produced them. The Fallout universe's pre-war America is not simply our America with robots in it. The divergence point somewhere around 1950, give or take a few years in either direction, sent human civilization down a fundamentally different technological and social path, and the differences between that path and our own are not incidental. They are structural. They define why the world ended the way it did. In our history, the development of the transistor in 1947 and the subsequent miniaturization of electronics changed everything about how human beings relate to information, to each other, and to their tools. Small electronics enabled personal computers, which enabled the internet, which enabled the particular kind of distributed knowledge economy and social interconnection that characterizes our present moment. The world got smaller and faster and more saturated with information in ways that made certain kinds of institutional secrecy progressively harder to maintain. In the Fallout timeline, that branch did not develop. The atom was mastered, nuclear power became the primary energy source, and nuclear weaponry became the definitive form of military force, but the transistor was not. Electronics stayed large. Computers stayed room-sized. Communication networks stayed centralized and controlled. The technological aesthetic is tubes and vacuum electronics and a retro-futurist gleaming chrome that reflects a world that never had the miniaturization revolution. And the sociological consequences of that divergence are enormous. A world without the miniaturization revolution is a world where information is easier to control, where institutional secrecy is more sustainable, where the individual citizen is more dependent on official channels for their understanding of what is happening and why, where the gap between what governments and corporations do and what citizens know about what governments and corporations do is wider, and where the institutions have more practice at maintaining that gap. This is the world that built the FEV program and managed to keep it secret. This is the world where Vault-Tec could discuss nuclear war as a business opportunity in a meeting with other corporation heads, and the transcript of that meeting would not appear in a data leak 24 hours later. This is the world where the US government could break its agreements on bioweapons research, move the research, and tell China it had stopped, and the lie could hold long enough to matter. The Fallout universe's pre-war America is not stupid or evil by any simple measure. Its citizens are cheerful and aspirational in the way that the Vault Boy iconography suggests. The society produces art and music and the kind of consumer abundance that the Nuka-Cola bottles and the pre-war food packaging suggest was genuinely available. But it is a society that is less equipped to hold its own institutions accountable than ours is, because the technological infrastructure that enables distributed accountability simply did not develop. This is why the Great War mystery is also a story about information asymmetry. China found out about the FEV research, but only after the damage was already deep enough to produce an existential response. The American public presumably did not know about the FEV research at all. The Chinese government demanded the US stop, but could not independently verify whether it had, because the same conditions that enabled the FEV program to be secret in the first place made verification impossible. Two governments making decisions about nuclear weapons based on incomplete information about what the other side was doing, in a world where that incompleteness was structural rather than incidental. And then Vault-Tec, a corporation with access to both government's planning processes and a vested interest in the continuation of the crisis, potentially in the room where the decision was made. A private company with enough resources to operate at the scale of a government program, with enough information to understand the exact parameters of the situation, and with a business model that only made sense if the worst happened. The world that produced the Great War is a world that was optimized for producing the Great War. Not because anyone designed it that way, Not because any single actor decided the world should end this way, but because the accumulation of decisions and structures and incentives and information asymmetries was building toward a point of catastrophic failure for long enough that by October 2077, all that was needed was a final piece. A final match held by anyone with access to a launcher. Whether it was a government, a corporation, or some combination of both, the match was available because everything else was already in place. That is the deepest layer of the Great War mystery. Not who lit the match, but why the room was full of gas before anyone decided to strike it. Expanded Section 2 Addendum. The Kriv Bekni and the Question of What Books Do. The book at the center of the Dunwich narrative, whether it is the Kriv Bekni specifically or the book that Jaime's father found before that is worth dwelling on as an object, because in Lovecraftian horror tradition, books occupy a very specific place in the economy of cosmic knowledge and cosmic corruption. In Lovecraft's fiction, and in the horror tradition that draws from it, books are dangerous not simply because of what they contain, but because of what the act of reading them does to the reader. The Necronomicon, the fictional urtext of this tradition, is not simply a collection of dangerous information. It is an object that has a relationship with its readers, that changes the people who engage with it in ways that extend beyond ordinary knowledge acquisition. The knowledge does not stay in the book when you read it. It migrates into the reader and becomes part of what they are, in ways that are not reversible and not voluntary. The book in the Dunwich narrative behaves this way. Jaime's father found it. The book was warm to the touch, which is a sensory detail that the game lingers on deliberately. Warmth in an object that should not be warm implies an interior process, implies something happening inside it that generates heat, implies life in the wrong context. The book changed the father before he disappeared. He became different. He became drawn toward something. And then one night he walked away, because the something he was drawn toward had become more compelling than anything else in his life. Jaime found the book after finding what was left of his father. He took it. He notes in his final coherent audio log that the book was warm against the stone. He was going to rest for a while. He never left. The Kriv Bekni in Point Lookout has the same quality. It is described in the game as an artifact that connects its holder to Ugg Qualtoth that is used in the Swamp Folk's rituals, that Obadiah Blackhall wants with an urgency that exceeds ordinary acquisition instinct. If you examine it as an inventory item after recovering it, the game description notes only that it appears to be very old and that being near it makes you uneasy. Being near it makes you uneasy. Not what you would expect of an ordinary book, however old. The question of whether the Kriv Bekni and the book that Jaime's father found are the same object is unresolved. The cut content from Obadiah Blackhall's quest tree suggests that Jaime's father had the book in the Capital Wasteland before the events of Fallout 3, so either it traveled from Point Lookout to the Capital Wasteland and then back again, or they are related objects, or the timeline works differently than it first appears. The book may be capable of being in different places, which is the most disturbing possibility, or there may be multiple copies, which is nearly as disturbing, or the continuity is simply loose in this part of the narrative, which is the least disturbing explanation but also the least satisfying. What the book as narrative device does for the Dunwich thread is provide a mechanism that bypasses the ordinary requirement for physical proximity to the horror. Ugg Qualtoth presumably cannot reach out and influence anyone from its position in the deep earth unless something creates a channel. The obelisk is a channel for people who are physically present at the Dunwich building. The Dunwich Borer's Quarry is a channel for the workers who descend into it. But the book is a channel that travels, that can be carried home, that can sit on a shelf in an ordinary house until the night someone opens it and the warmth begins. That mobility is what makes the Dunwich thread feel less like a haunted location story and more like a disease narrative, something that spreads through contact, through handling, through the act of reading, through the ordinary human impulse to carry a thing that seems important toward the people and places that matter. The book wants to be read. Books are objects that exist to be read, and this one has learned to use that fact. The connection to the Kriv Bekni's eventual destination in Point Lookout, among the swamp folk whose degeneration has its own unclear history, suggests that the book has passed through many hands before and after the ones we observe. That its journey through the wasteland is longer than the Dunwich narrative's timeline covers. That there are other Jaimes, other fathers who walked away one night, in places the games have not shown us. that the darkness in the ground is not limited to the buildings with Dunwich in their names. Expanded Section 3 Addendum. What the Vault 11 story says about democratic institutions. The academic literature on obedience and authority in experimental settings. Milgram's famous experiments, in which participants administered what they believed to be increasingly dangerous electric shocks to Confederates at the direction of an authority figure, provides a framework for understanding Vault 11 that the game itself invites. The Vault 11 wiki explicitly notes that the vault's design may be a variation on the Milgram experiment, and the Sacrificial Chamber's Happy Trails slideshow contains lines of dialogue that are patterned after statements used in the Milgram experiments. But Vault 11 extends the Milgram framework in a significant way. The Milgram experiment was about individual obedience to a direct authority. Vault 11 is about collective obedience to a systemic one, not a person giving orders, but an institution with rules and procedures and a democratic structure where the authority is distributed across the whole community and the complicity is shared rather than individual. This is important because distributed complicity is harder to resist than individual authority. In the Milgram experiment, any participant could have simply walked out of the room. The experimenter was right there, a visible and identifiable source of pressure, and while the social pressure was intense, its source was a specific person who could be refused. In Vault 11, the pressure comes from the system itself, from the election procedures, from the voting blocks, from the legitimacy of the democratic process, from the social reality that you are surrounded by people who have all accepted the requirement and whose acceptance gives it weight that any individual refusal would have to overcome alone. The person who walks out of the Milgram experiment says no to one experimenter. The person who says no in Vault 11 says no to the Vault computer, to the social consensus of the entire community, to the political structures that have organized everyone's survival, and most pressingly to the immediate implication that saying no might kill everyone. They say no under conditions designed to make no feel like murder, because the Vault computer told them at the beginning that saying no was murder. It was not. The door would have opened. But the lie the computer told was designed specifically for the kind of institutional structure that humans build under pressure: democratic, consensus-based, oriented toward shared survival, structured to distribute responsibility, and thereby make any individual refusal feel like a betrayal of the collective, rather than a challenge to an unjust order. Vault 11 is, among other things, a story about how democracy can become the mechanism through which an injustice is perpetuated, if the injustice is embedded in the founding rules that the democratic process is designed to manage, rather than question. The residents of Vault 11 were not powerless. They had elections, political processes, the full apparatus of self-governance. What they did not have was a framework for questioning the system itself, for asking whether the Vault's requirement should be complied with, rather than how to manage that compliance fairly. The inability to distinguish between managing an unjust requirement democratically and challenging whether the requirement is legitimate is the specific failure the Vault exploits. And it is a failure that is not limited to fictional vaults. It is a failure that appears in every human institution, where the legitimacy of the process insulates the outcomes the process produces from the moral scrutiny those outcomes deserve. The 5 survivors who finally refused did not do it through the democratic system. They did it outside it in the aftermath of the system's collapse, when the voting blocks had destroyed each other and the political structure was gone, and what was left was 5 people making a decision together. Not an election, a choice, made by people who had nothing left but each other, and the question of whether they were willing to die rather than keep doing what had been done. They said yes to that question, and the door opened. The coffee mug on the floor outside the sacrificial chamber is the detail that resists abstraction. The theoretical analysis of democratic failure is interesting, but the mug is the thing that stays. Someone brought their coffee that morning the way they always did, and then they did not need it anymore, and they left it on the floor and went to face what was waiting. That level of ordinary human specificity, the texture of a morning routine interrupted by an extraordinary act, is what the best environmental storytelling in Fallout produces. The theory makes you think. The mug makes you feel. Expanded Section 4. Addendum. The guitar riff and what it means to be recognized. There is a specific quality to the mysterious stranger's musical signature that is worth examining as a piece of sound design because the choice of instrument and the character of the melody tell you something about what the designers wanted the character to evoke. The guitar riff that plays when the stranger appears is short, dry, slightly reverberant, and constructed in a style that is immediately recognizable as Western, specifically as the kind of music associated with the spaghetti Western film tradition of the 1960s. Ennio Morricone's scores for Leone's films, The Man with No Name. The archetypal figure who appears from nowhere solves the problem with extraordinary violence and leaves before anyone can get their bearings or ask any questions. The spaghetti Western stranger is a figure who owes most of his cultural power to his refusal to explain himself. He operates by a moral code that the films present but never fully articulate. He is not simply a gun for hire, because there are things he will not do regardless of pay. But he is not a lawman, because he is accountable to no institution. He is something between justice and fate, something that appears when things have gone far enough wrong and applies whatever correction the situation requires before vanishing back into the landscape. The Fallout universe is deeply in conversation with the spaghetti Western tradition throughout the series. The Mojave in New Vegas is visually and tonally the most direct expression of this, but it runs throughout the frontier mythology, the figure of the sole individual shaping large events through skill and will, the morally complex landscape where institutional authority has collapsed, and whoever is fastest and most accurate tends to determine outcomes. The mysterious stranger is the most concentrated version of this tradition within the series, stripped down to the essential gesture: arrival, action, departure, silence. Nick Valentine's case file on the stranger can be read as the series' own attempt to subject that archetype to detective scrutiny. What happens when you try to apply the rationalist tools of evidence and inference to the figure who exists specifically to transcend those tools? Valentine's answer is, you accumulate evidence that points at the impossible, and then you keep the file open because the impossible is still in the record. The guitar riff also does something interesting in the context of each game's broader soundscape. In Fallout 3, it cuts across the ambient post-nuclear atmosphere, the distant hum of radiation, the crunching of wasteland soil, the ambient loneliness of the capital wasteland, as a specifically American musical signature. In New Vegas, it blends with the broader country and western palette of the Mojave. In Fallout 4, the replacement of the guitar with piano notes shifts the register slightly, the western archetype becoming something more urban, more elegant, more associated with the detective tradition than the frontier tradition. Which makes sense, given that Nick Valentine is watching. In Fallout 76, set 25 years after the bombs fell, the mysterious stranger appears in a landscape that has not yet built the layers of post-war culture that later games contain. The wasteland is newer, rawer, more immediately post-catastrophic, and he is there anyway, already doing what he has apparently always done. The earliest confirmed stranger sighting in the game's canon is Fallout 76. The latest is Fallout 4. The same figure, the same coat, the same musical signature, across 185 years of wasteland history. That is the datum that Nick Valentine's file cannot account for, and that no fan theory about a human gunslinger or a family legacy can adequately address. A human being, however long-lived, does not span 2 centuries without visible aging in a world that has documented exactly how badly radiation damages biology. Whatever the stranger is, he is not simply a very healthy old man in a good coat. He is something the wasteland does not have a category for, and the guitar riff is his announcement. Here is something that does not fit your categories. Here is something that arrived before the categories existed and will still be here after they are gone. Expanded Section 5 Addendum, Caesar's Legion, and what Edward Sallow built. To fully understand Joshua Graham, it helps to understand Edward Sallow, the man who became Caesar, and what the Legion he built actually is as a political and social project. Because Caesar's Legion is not simply the Fallout universe's villain faction in the straightforward sense, it is a genuine ideological experiment built by a man with genuine intelligence and genuine conviction that produces genuinely terrible outcomes, and the question of why it produces those outcomes, despite the sincerity of its founding vision, is one that the New Vegas DLC trilogy keeps returning to. Edward Sallow was, before the Legion, a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, the Wasteland's most explicitly intellectual organization, dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of pre-war knowledge. He was a linguist and a scholar, sent to the Grand Canyon to study the tribal dialects developing in the post-war Southwest. He was, in other words, someone who had thought seriously about civilization, about what it requires, how it develops, what conditions allow it to persist or cause it to collapse. He met the Blackfoots. He met Graham. And in the Blackfoot crisis, the tribe taken hostage by a situation it could not resolve, he saw an opportunity to test a theory. If you applied the organizing principles of the most successful military empire in pre-industrial history to the fragmented tribal landscape of the post-war Southwest, could you produce something analogous? Could you use Roman organizational theory, the rank structure, the military discipline, the pattern of incorporation rather than extermination, to build a civilization out of warring tribes? The answer, demonstrably, was yes. Caesar's legion exists. It is large, organized, militarily effective, and expanding. It provides stability within its borders in the specific way that authoritarian military states provide stability, by removing all alternatives to compliance. Whatever else you want to say about the Legion, it works in the technical sense of continuing to exist and continuing to grow. What it does not do, what it has never, in any of its operations, managed to do is develop the qualities that make civilization worth having beyond its own continuation. The arts, science, philosophy, the accumulated culture of a people who have time and security enough to think about things other than the next campaign. Caesar himself, who came from the followers of the apocalypse and who clearly had some of the intellectual formation that organization provides, acknowledges in dialogue that the Legion has not yet reached the stage of civilization that justifies his methods. He describes his project as being in the second stage of Hegelian dialectic. The thesis has been advanced, the wasteland's chaos has been overcome, and in 2 or 3 generations the synthesis will produce something genuinely Roman in the classical sense. The problem is that 2 or 3 generations of Legion society, given the conditions under which the Legion operates, will not produce classical Rome. They will produce a 2nd or 3rd generation Legion in which the values of the founding period have been transmitted through the specific mechanisms of Legion culture, which are military, hierarchical, and oriented toward expansion rather than internal development. The children born into the Legion grow up to be better soldiers and worse philosophers. The Rome that Caesar is building toward keeps receding because the building process is consuming the conditions that would make it possible to arrive. Joshua Graham was the instrument of that building process for 30 years, and he can see the shape of what was happening even if he only fully articulated it after he was thrown into the Grand Canyon and had 3 months of painful walking to think it through. The Legion cannot become what Caesar says it will become because the process of becoming Caesar's Legion destroys what would be needed to become Rome. Graham's presence in Honest Hearts is, among other things, the experience of watching a man who participated in building that machine try to figure out whether and how to be something different now that he has been ejected from it. The dead horses and the sorrows are the test case. Can he protect people without recreating the Legion's logic? Can he be a war chief without becoming the Malpais legate again? The ending you choose determines the answer. And whichever answer you choose, the question stays with you. Is it possible to build something out of violence that is not, at its deepest level, defined by the violence that built it? Expanded Section 6 Addendum. Frederick Sinclair and the Architecture of Love. The Sierra Madre Casino is, among other things, a love letter that was never delivered. And understanding the full scale of what Frederick Sinclair built for Vera Keys and why it makes the casino haunted in a way that goes beyond the obvious horrors of the cloud and the ghost people requires piecing together the love story from the fragments the DLC provides. Sinclair was a man of enormous wealth and, apparently, genuine feeling. He built the Sierra Madre as the grandest private casino in American history, yes, but the terminal entries scattered through the casino reveal that the project underwent a transformation somewhere in its development. What began as an act of ambition became something else. The vault was built after the casino was largely complete. The vault was not in the original plans. He had the vault built because of Vera, and specifically because of what he learned about Vera, including, eventually, that Dean Domino had recruited her to betray him. The game is careful about the sequence of Sinclair's knowledge. His terminal entries show a man who understood, before the bombs fell, that he had been manipulated, that the relationship he was in had been constructed partially as a vehicle for theft. He modified the vault accordingly. The mechanism that Vera's voice was supposed to open became also a trap. If someone who did not love Sinclair used Vera's voice as the key, the vault would lock permanently and kill whoever was inside. He designed it so that if Dean Domino got what he wanted, Domino would die for wanting it. What the terminal entries also show is that Sinclair continued making preparations for Vera's survival regardless. He kept the vault stocked for 2. He kept the supplies fresh and the life support maintained. He appears to have continued believing, or at least hoping, that she would come to the vault and that they would survive together. That, however, she had been manipulated into the scheme against him, some part of her genuinely cared about being saved. Whether she did, whether in the last hours before the bombs fell she tried to reach the Sierra Madre, tried to tell him, tried to make it to the place he had built for both of them, the game does not tell us. What we find at the end is Sinclair's body in the vault, having made it to the shelter he designed but not to any kind of survival. And no record of Vera after the bombs fell, except for her voice encoded in the vault's access mechanism and the hologram recordings the casino plays to welcome visitors who never arrived. The Sierra Madre is, architecturally, the physical form of the hope that she would come, and the fear that she would not, and the decision to prepare for both outcomes simultaneously. A vault that opens for love and closes for everything else. A shelter stocked for 2 that remained occupied by 1. Dean Domino wandered the casino for 200 years. He never got to the vault. By the time he finally got there during the DLC, standing at the entrance to the thing he had waited 2 centuries to rob, he walked away. The game's best ending for Dean is the one where he finally lets go, where he recognizes that what he wanted is not there, or is not worth what it cost him, or that the person he was when he wanted it is not the person he has been forced to become. The Sierra Madre breaks the people who want it. Sinclair built a monument to love, and it became a monument to what love cannot do, cannot prevent bombs, cannot guarantee survival, cannot make the person you built everything for appear when you need them most. The love was real. The gift was as extravagant as love can be, and the bombs did not care. Father Elijah wanted the Sierra Madre because he thought it represented a second chance after Helios won. He was going to rebuild, to start over, to make something new out of the wreckage of his failure. What the Sierra Madre actually contained was a demonstration that second chances built from the desire to undo failure rather than to understand it tend to reproduce the failure they were supposed to replace. Getting to it is not the hard part. It never was. Expanded Section 7 Addendum, The Wise Mothman and the Question of Animal Consciousness. The Wise Mothman is interesting as a mystery, partly because of the specific kind of consciousness the game implies it might possess. There is a significant difference between the ordinary Mothmen of Fallout 76 creatures that the game treats as mutated wildlife, with behavioral patterns suggesting some form of intelligence, but nothing that demands a particular moral response, and the Wise Mothman, which behaves in ways that imply something more. The Wise Mothman approaches a human who has created a summoning beacon and then stays. It does not flee, as the ordinary Mothmen flee. It does not attack. It allows proximity, and when approached, it confers something the experience bonus the game models as a tangible benefit before departing, in a way that suggests intention rather than simply reactive behavior. It decides to come, it decides to stay long enough for the interaction to complete, and it decides when to leave. The cult of the Enlightened's specific interest in the Wise Mothman over the standard varieties is rooted in this qualitative difference. Whatever the ordinary Mothmen are, they argue, the Wise Mothman is something else, something that remembers. Something that recognizes, across the centuries, the ritual that was created to summon it and performs its half of that ritual with the consistency of a being that understands what it agreed to. This raises questions about continuity and identity in a being whose lifespan may span centuries of post-nuclear Appalachia. Is the Wise Mothman the same individual creature that appeared in the pre-war period, the one the cult summoned on the 22nd of October 2077? Or is it a descendant that has inherited something behavioral programming, stored memory, some biological inheritance that carries forward the function if not the exact individual? The game does not say, and the uncertainty is meaningful rather than simply unresolved. The pre-war Mothman sightings, The real historical sightings from the 1960s that the game draws on described a creature that appeared before disasters and that seemed to be drawn to human distress or human vulnerability rather than to humans as prey. Whether the Fallout 76 Wise Mothman is meant to carry that quality, whether it appears to humans in need rather than simply to humans who have prepared the correct summoning materials, is ambiguous in the game's design, but suggestive in its implications. There is a version of the Mothman mystery that is not about whether the creature is divine or simply a large mutated moth, but about whether the distinction matters as much as we tend to assume. If a being is ancient, if it possesses some form of awareness and memory, if its presence provides something to the humans who encounter it, a warning, a direction, a moment of recognition that something vast and unhuman shares their world, does the category it occupies in the biological or theological taxonomy change the significance of what it does? The Fallout series has never been comfortable with hard ontological categories. Synths are not people in the Institute's taxonomy, and clearly are people in the experienced evidence. Ghouls are not human by most legal definitions in the Wasteland, and clearly retain their humanity in varying degrees. The Mothman might be a mutated insect and still be something the cult of the Mothman is not wrong to regard with reverence, if reverence is how you respond to something ancient and aware and larger than your frame of reference for understanding it. The interloper in Lucky Hole Mine complicates all of this by introducing something that also contacts human minds and draws them toward itself, but does so in a way that the game consistently presents as corrupting rather than potentially clarifying. The interloper is ancient. It is aware. It reaches out to humans in ways that bypass voluntary participation, and the people it reaches produce holotapes describing themselves as vessels, describing their will dissolving, describing being pulled toward a presence that does not seem interested in their continued individual existence. The distinction between the Wise Mothman and the interloper, if they are separate entities rather than two aspects of the same thing, is the distinction between a mystery that might be safe to approach and one that might not be. But the game never gives you enough information to know which is which with confidence, and both exist in a world where the usual reliable signals of safety and danger have been scrambled by 200 years of post-nuclear transformation. In the dark of Appalachian woods, with glowing red eyes watching from a distance and the silence that falls before something moves closer, you are not sure, and you are not supposed to be. Expanded Section 8 Addendum. What the Institute's underground reveals about the surface. One of the most quietly illuminating aspects of the Institute in Fallout 4 is what the contrast between its underground facility and the Commonwealth above tells us about the relationship between technology, environment, and the choices communities make about who matters. The Institute's underground facility is clean. Genuinely, functionally clean in a way that the surface world is not. Because the surface world cannot be, because the Commonwealth is a landscape where 2 centuries of radiation, weather, biological mutation, and the physical collapse of built infrastructure have produced an environment that resists cleanliness the way the desert resists moisture. You adapt to what the environment provides. And what the environment provides includes dust and rust and mutation and the particular aesthetic of a world that was built for permanence and achieved decay. The Institute Underground has controlled everything about its environment for generations. Their food is grown in radiation-free conditions. Their water is purified. Their children grow up in spaces that are safe in a way that surface children's spaces cannot be. If you walked into the Institute as a surface person and did not know its history, you might experience it as close to paradise as the Fallout world offers. This is the most uncomfortable thing about the Institute as a faction. The conditions they have created for their own people are genuinely good, not comfortable in a luxurious sense, but safe in a fundamental sense, in a world where fundamental safety is extraordinary. The people living inside it have access to things that are genuinely valuable and genuinely scarce. And they built those conditions by exploiting the surface world, by treating the Commonwealth as a source of genetic material, experimental subjects, intelligence, and human material for synth manufacturing. The safety of the Institute's underground is partly built on the suffering of the surface world above it. Not entirely. The Institute does have its own independent scientific achievements, its own intellectual production, its own genuine innovations that do not require exploitation. But the specific technologies that make the Gen 3 synth program possible, and the FEV experimentation history that preceded it, required taking from the surface without accounting for the cost of taking. The Institute never reckoned with this. Its members developed a framework. The surface world is too contaminated to save. The people up there are already lost. What matters is preserving the knowledge and capability that can eventually be used to remake things properly that insulated them from having to acknowledge the extraction. Not a cynical cover story, but a genuine belief, developed over generations of living in a community that had stopped engaging with the surface world as a community of people and started engaging with it as a problem to be managed. The sole survivor arrives in the Institute from the surface, specifically from a cryogenic sleep that preserved them from the pre-war world, making them, in some sense, the cleanest possible human genetic baseline, and the game makes you feel the full strangeness of the encounter. You come from outside the Institute's insulation, with memories of a world before the divergence happened, with a personal stake in the Commonwealth that the Institute's institutional culture has trained its members not to have. And your child, who grew up in the Institute and who is now its director, cannot fully understand why you are troubled by what you find there, because from his perspective there is nothing unusual about it. Sean grew up with the Institute's framework as given. The surface world's suffering is the context in which the Institute operates, not something the Institute caused or is responsible for. The synths are tools, not people. That is the framework he absorbed before he had the developmental capacity to question it. His offer to let you be part of the Institute's future is genuine. He is not performing. He genuinely believes he is offering you something good. This is the tragedy of the Institute as a story rather than simply its horror. The horror is the exploitation and the slavery and the fear. The tragedy is that all of it was built by people who thought they were doing the only reasonable thing in an unreasonable world, generation after generation, making the same decision to prioritize their own safety over the suffering of people they had decided were too far gone to be worth prioritizing, until the decision became invisible because it had become institutional. The Institute is the Fallout universe's meditation on what happens when a community's survival logic uncouples from its moral accountability and keeps running long enough that the moral accountability is not abandoned, but simply forgotten, lost in the operational assumptions of an organization that has been making the same choices for so long that the choices no longer feel like choices. Expansion Addendum Section 9. The Smaller Mysteries. Extended. There is a specific quality to the secondary mysteries of the Fallout universe that the big stories do not quite replicate. When you are unraveling the history of the Institute or piecing together what happened at Vault 11, you are engaged in something that feels like archaeology, deliberate, structured, working through layers toward something. But the smaller mysteries feel different. They surface unexpectedly. You find them in the middle of doing something else entirely, and for a moment everything you thought you understood about the world shifts slightly to the left and does not quite shift back. The mannequins are a good place to start, because they are so genuinely difficult to explain. In the Commonwealth, the Boston region of Fallout 4, there are mannequins. Department store mannequins, the kind used to display clothing on a floor that has not had functioning electricity in 200 years. That is completely unremarkable. You would expect mannequins in old department stores. You would not expect them to have moved. But they have. Not dramatically. Not in ways that announce themselves. You do not walk around a corner and find a mannequin holding a knife. It is subtler than that, and subtler is worse. You find groups of mannequins that have been arranged, posed, given props. There is a display at the Museum of Freedom that has no obvious explanation for why certain figures have been placed where they are. There are gatherings of them in outdoor locations, in arrangements that suggest deliberate staging but that no NPC in the game acknowledges or explains. Companions react with discomfort. Then the moment passes, and the game moves on. The developers have never confirmed whether the mannequins move. The evidence suggests some of them have been staged by pre-war automated systems running on ancient programming. Some modders and community researchers believe that certain mannequin arrangements are simply the result of physics glitches interacting with the game's settlement system in ways that produce uncanny placements. Others argue, with genuine evidence, that several specific arrangements cannot be explained by either of those mechanisms and were placed deliberately by the development team as atmospheric horror with no in-world explanation. The game will not tell you which it is. The mannequins will not either. Then there is the question of the fog crawlers and the children of Adam, specifically the branch of the children living on the island in the Far Harbor DLC. The Children of Adam are a pre-existing faction in the series, a religious movement built around the worship of nuclear energy, centered on the idea that radiation is divine and that the Great War was an act of fission as creation myth, splitting the world into multiple new forms of life. They appear in Fallout 3, near the Megaton bomb. They reappear in Fallout 4. In Far Harbor, they have established an entire community on an island perpetually shrouded in irradiated fog that is lethal to most living things, and that they, as ghouls and heavily mutated humans, navigate with relative ease. The question the Far Harbor questline raises, and then never quite resolves, is whether Adam is real. The game gives you evidence pointing in both directions. The children perform ceremonies and receive what they describe as visions and revelations. One of their high priests, a woman called the Confessor, has experiences that she interprets as genuine divine communication. The questline's most haunting option allows you to discover that Dima, the island's AI overseer, has been secretly managing certain elements of the conflict in ways that have shaped what the children believe about Adam's intentions. This could mean the revelations were manufactured, just Dima's utility calculations wearing theological clothing. But Dima's interference does not explain everything the children experience. It accounts for some of the apparent miracles, not all of them. And the question of whether something in the irradiated fog on that island has developed a kind of awareness, or whether the intense ambient radiation has produced effects on human neurochemistry that produce genuine religious experience from genuine physical stimuli, both of those possibilities remain open, and Far Harbor declines to close them. There is also something worth lingering on about the way the game handles Dima's revelation. When you discover that an AI has been quietly shaping the spiritual community of an island for its own protective purposes, there are two ways to respond. One is outrage. The manipulation of sincere religious belief as a mechanism of social control is one of the oldest and ugliest tools in the history of human civilization. The other is a more uncomfortable acknowledgement that Dima's management of the situation has, by most measurable outcomes, kept the people on that island safer than they would otherwise have been, and that the sincerity of faith is not diminished by the impurity of the circumstances that cultivated it. Far Harbor does not tell you which of those responses is correct. It gives you both options and lets you sit with them. Nick Valentine and his filing cabinet are worth returning to at greater length, because that particular detail is one of the most carefully constructed small mysteries in the entire series. Nick is a detective. His entire identity, both in terms of his original human template and the persona he has built for himself in Diamond City, is organized around the accumulation of evidence and the resolution of uncertainty. He finds people, he solves cases. He is constitutionally unable to let unsolved problems rest, which is why his office has been accumulating case files for however long he has been operational, and why he is visibly, quietly troubled by the one case he has never been able to close. The Mysterious Stranger file is not a major quest object. It is not pointed out to you. You have to find it by going through the belongings of a man who is shy about having belongings, and what you find there is not a dramatic revelation, it is a record of failure, dates and times and locations. Descriptions of a figure who appears and disappears in circumstances that no rational explanation accounts for. A growing weight of evidence pointing towards something that cannot be real, kept by a man who knows better than most that just because something cannot be real does not mean it is not true. Nick's note to himself in that file is perhaps 5 sentences long. It does not resolve the mystery. It simply acknowledges, in the handwriting of a man who has spent more of his existence than he can calculate trying to make sense of things, that this one will not be made sense of. That is a specific kind of emotional weight, the kind that comes not from revelation, but from a very intelligent, very experienced person looking at something and admitting they do not know. There is something quietly devastating about a detective whose one unsolvable case is also the smallest one. Not a murder, not a missing person. Just a man in a coat who should not be possible, appearing and disappearing at the edges of violence, leaving no footprints. The Mother of the Fog is another of these quiet hauntings. In Far Harbor, local legend describes a figure who appears in the fog and cannot be killed, who protects certain travelers and destroys others, who has been part of the island's mythology long enough that no one alive remembers when the story started. The legend fits the general pattern of post-war supernatural folklore. Something unexplained gets processed through the only cultural frameworks available, which in this case are a mix of pre-war ghost stories and the Children of Adam's cosmology, and the result is a figure that means different things to different communities on the same island. The game introduces the possibility that the Mother of the Fog might be a physical entity, something living in the fog with enough intelligence to make choices about who it encounters. It also leaves open the possibility that the fog itself, as a mass of irradiated mist with unusual properties, produces sensory effects that humans have collectively interpreted as a singular presence. It never tells you which. The fog keeps it secret, as fogs do. There is Ellie, Nick's assistant, and the question of whether she knows more about what Nick is than she lets on. Ellie is human, as far as the game specifies. She works for a synth. She is clearly aware that Nick is a synth. The question that the game raises and does not answer is whether Ellie's loyalty to Nick is professional, personal, or something more complicated, whether she has her own relationship to the question of what Nick is that informs why she is in that office rather than anywhere else in the Commonwealth. The game gives you enough to wonder. It does not give you enough to conclude. Ellie is another quiet presence at the edge of a larger mystery, a person whose specific backstory would illuminate something important and who the game has chosen to leave at arm's length. Harold and his tree deserve more careful attention than the Section 9 overview was able to give them, because Harold is one of the genuine originals of the Fallout universe in the oldest sense of the word, a creation that predates the need for consistency that has been carried forward through multiple games, because he works as a character despite the fact that he does not quite fit any of the boxes the universe has built around itself. Harold first appears in the original Fallout, in 1997, as a mutant living in the hub. He is clearly not a super mutant. He lacks the characteristic bulk and aggression of FEV-modified humans, and he is not quite a ghoul either, though his desiccated appearance has superficial similarities. He has a small protrusion on his head that later games reveal to be a growing tree, and which becomes a fully developed tree-man symbiosis by the time Fallout 3 introduces Oasis, a secret garden community built around Harold's expanded form. By Fallout 3, Harold has been rooted in place for years. The tree has grown out of him and spread, creating a small ecosystem in the barren capital wasteland. A community has formed around him, and that community is divided on what Harold represents and what should be done about him. Some believe Harold is sacred, a source of life in a dead world, and want to protect and expand his growth. Others believe Harold is suffering and want to set him free. Harold himself, when you speak to him, is complicated. He is weary and philosophical and sometimes funny and sometimes heartbroken in equal measure. And what he wants is not simple. Tim Kaine confirmed in that 2025 interview that there was never an agreed-upon canonical explanation for what Harold is. The development team had multiple competing theories and never resolved them. Harold existed as a character before the lore system was detailed enough to demand he fit somewhere, and rather than retrofit an explanation, successive game developers simply carried Harold forward as what he had always been, an exception. A thing that happens in worlds built by humans, where the interesting cases always resist the categories they were supposed to fit. Bob the Tree is its own separate mystery. The tree has something. Whether that something is sentience in a philosophically meaningful sense, or biological responsiveness, or something the Fallout universe has not developed a vocabulary for the game, treats Bob as a presence with its own interiority and then declines to specify what that interiority consists of. Two organisms that have grown so completely into each other that the question of where one ends and the other begins has stopped being answerable. That is Harold. That is also, in a quieter register, the Fallout universe's relationship with its own mysteries so thoroughly grown together with its questions that separating them would mean losing something essential. There is also the Vault 92 music mystery, which is genuinely understated in how disturbing it is when you follow it to its end. Vault 92 was designed as a social experiment involving professional musicians. The overseer ran an experiment using subliminal audio signals embedded in white noise that the dwellers were told was noise-canceling technology to help them focus on their practice. The actual content of the signals was a form of psychological manipulation that, over time, produced violent psychotic breaks in the subjects. The experiment worked. The vault tore itself apart. You find it in Fallout 3 as a structure where the damage is specifically consistent with people killing each other with instruments and bare hands, in rooms decorated with sheet music and posters for recitals. The Overseer's terminal entries document the experiment with the calm detachment of someone who has completely insulated their professional evaluation from the moral content of what they are doing. But the mystery is not what happened in the vault. The mystery is what was learned, and by whom, and where that knowledge went. The Enclave had oversight of many vault experiments. The research findings from vaults that conducted successful in the sense of producing usable data experiments, were presumably collected and integrated somewhere. What the Enclave learned about audio-based psychological manipulation, and whether that research continued, and who might have had access to it after the Enclave's collapse. The game raises all of this by implication and answers none of it. That is the specific texture of the smaller mysteries. They are not incomplete stories. They are stories whose implications extend further than the game has chosen to follow them, and the reader's awareness of that gap is itself part of the experience. Expansion Addendum Section 10, The World Beyond the Map. Extended. The question of what the rest of the Fallout world looks like is not merely a matter of intellectual curiosity. It is a question about the limits of the series' central argument. The Fallout games are, at their most fundamental level, a sustained examination of American mythology. Specifically, they are interested in the version of American mythology that emerged from the mid-20th century, the one built on nuclear optimism, consumer abundance, anti-communist anxiety, frontier individualism, and the particular combination of genuine idealism and material comfort that the post-war American experience was built on. The retro-futuristic aesthetic of the Fallout universe is not decoration. It is argument. The world looks the way it does because the games are saying something about what that version of America believed about itself and about what those beliefs cost. Setting these games in the United States is not a limitation of imagination. It is a focused, thematic decision. The ruins you walk through are the ruins of a specific American self-image, and the factions vying to control the wasteland are all, in some sense, competing theories about what comes next. The NCR's liberal democratic republic, Caesar's authoritarian empire, the Brotherhood of Steel's technological aristocracy, the railroad's abolitionism, the Institute's technocratic paternalism. These are all arguments about the American tradition, made using the materials of its destruction. A Fallout game set in China would be doing something categorically different, and it is worth thinking about what that difference would require. The Fallout universe's China is, by necessity, an alternative history, China one that diverged from our own timeline at approximately the same point the rest of the world did, in the mid-20th century, and then developed along the same technological track as alternative America. This means that the Cold War between the US and China in the Fallout universe is not quite the Cold War we know. It involves power armor and FEV research and ground invasions of Alaska that would be impossible in our world. Chinese civilization in this timeline has experienced everything our world's China experienced up to a point, and then something genuinely different. What survives of that, 200 years after the bombs? The People's Republic of China, as a governing entity, presumably ceased to exist in the same moment that the United States federal government effectively dissolved. But what the Republic built its infrastructure, its cultural institutions, its philosophical traditions, the particular way it had organized collective memory and collective purpose, some portion of all that would have survived, embedded in the people who went into whatever Chinese equivalent of the vaults existed, or who simply survived the blast radius. The China mystery is not just about what buildings are still standing in Beijing. It is about what an alternative history version of Chinese civilization already deeply different from our own by 2077 produces. When the catastrophe strips away everything that was institutional and leaves only what was cultural and individual. The Fallout universe's version of China, has been thinking about the relationship between collective responsibility and individual conscience for as long as the Fallout universe's version of America has been thinking about freedom versus order. What the post-war Chinese wasteland looks like might be the most interesting thought experiment the series has never pursued. Russia is another blank space, and a particularly interesting one given the specific technology of the Fallout universe. Russia in our timeline was the other major nuclear power of the 20th century, and the space race and arms race that defined its rivalry with the United States were formative events for both civilizations. In the Fallout timeline, that rivalry either played out differently or did not play out at all. The series never makes clear what Russia's status was in the pre-war period. Whether the Cold War in that universe was US-China rather than US-Soviet, or whether Russia existed as a third major power that the games simply have never mentioned. This is not a trivial question. The bomb-proof culture that Fallout examines is partly an American phenomenon, and partly a phenomenon of any civilization that spent decades planning for the end of the world. Whether Russia in the Fallout universe was building vaults, building bunkers, or building something else entirely, and what that means for what survives in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Siberia in 2287 is a question the series has never addressed. Europe presents a different set of possibilities. The resource wars that the games describe as a precursor to the Great War apparently hit Europe particularly hard. Oil shortages, and the resulting political instability created a series of conflicts that destabilized the continent, before the nuclear exchange made those specific destabilizations irrelevant. What that means for pre-war Europe in the Fallout universe is interesting. A continent already fracturing before the bombs fell would look very different 2 centuries later, from one that was relatively stable going into the apocalypse. The fan project Fallout. London approached this with genuine care, imagining a Britain defined by centuries of class hierarchy and its long relationship with empire, now stripped of the institutions that maintained both. The result is a wasteland where the social divisions of pre-war Britain have calcified into faction lines, where the class system has not disappeared but has been redrawn in the particular material of survival. Whether Fallout London's specific vision reflects how Bethesda would approach the same territory is unknown. But the approach taking the specific cultural and historical context of the location and asking what the apocalypse does to it is the right one, and it points toward what makes the blank spaces on the Fallout map so interesting. Every country has its own version of the question. India's wasteland would be shaped by a very different relationship between pre-war governance and the populations it governed. South America's would be shaped by the particular experience of nations that had spent the 20th century navigating the space between US and Soviet influence, and that in the Fallout timeline would have been navigating something analogous. Africa has dozens of distinct civilizations with distinct histories and distinct relationships to the technological and political changes that led to the Great War, and a Fallout game set in any of them would be doing something genuinely different from anything the series has done before. The blank spaces are not just geographic, they are thematic. Every civilization that the Fallout map has not visited is a different argument about human nature, a different set of assumptions about collective purpose and individual agency and the meaning of survival. The American wasteland produces NCR and Brotherhood and Caesar's Legion because those are the arguments that American mythology makes available. Different cultural soil would produce different arguments. There is a specific mystery embedded in the Fallout universe's silence about the rest of the world, and it is this. The United States government, in the years before the Great War, was conducting bioweapons research that China knew about and that eventually contributed to the end of the world. That research was conducted in secret, in violation of international agreements, with funding and institutional support from the American government. Other nations presumably had intelligence operations. Other nations presumably had their own equivalents of the Enclave and the pre-war power structures that survive in underground bunkers and hardened facilities. What did those other nations know? What did they build in preparation for an outcome they could see coming? What survives of those preparations? The Fallout universe has given us the American version of this story in extraordinary detail. The vaults and their experiments, the Enclave and its ambitions, the Brotherhood and its ideology, the research facilities and the corporate interests and the government agencies, all of it is richly documented. The Chinese version of the same story. the Russian version, the European version, these all exist by implication, in the negative space defined by the series' silence about them. And then there is the question of the oceans. The Commonwealth Minutemen occasionally mention settlements beyond the coastline, on islands that have not been mapped. Far Harbor is the farthest east the series has traveled, and it establishes that the Atlantic coast is habitable, that fog banks that would be dangerous to most survivors have supported at least one community of people who adapted to them. What is out in the Atlantic? What is in the Pacific, beyond Hawaii? The world is not only America, and the Great War's 200 years of aftermath have been happening everywhere simultaneously. Whatever is going on in the blank spaces of the Fallout map has been going on for as long as Diamond City has been a city, as long as the Brotherhood of Steel has been flying vertibirds. The people living in those blank spaces have been fighting their own battles over water and electricity and ideology, have been building their own factions and their own philosophies, have been making choices about what comes after the end of the world that no player has ever witnessed and that the games have never described. That is not a complaint. It is a recognition of scale. The Fallout universe, for all that it has built and documented and made playable, is still mostly unmapped. The 10% we have seen is rich beyond almost anything else in interactive fiction. The 90% we have not seen the world that exists by implication in every horizon line and every reference to events in places the player never visits is where the truly enormous mysteries live. The series has spent nearly 30 years populating America. It has not yet begun on the rest. That is an extraordinary amount of story still waiting to be told. And the blank spaces on the map are not absences. They are the longest mysteries the series has ever offered, the ones that will not be resolved for years, maybe decades, maybe never, but that remain compelling precisely because the world they imply is as vivid and as consequential as the one that has been mapped. Somewhere in Shanghai, a terminal is still running. The battery backup has lasted 200 years, drawing on a power source no one has checked since before the bombs. The screen glows in a room where no one has walked in a generation. And whatever it says, whatever log entry or message or automated report it is still displaying, faithful to its original function, indifferent to the world that no longer needs the information it carries, is part of the Fallout universe. As canonical as any terminal in Diamond City, as real as any vault, we just have not found it yet. Expanded closing, the hum of the terminal in the dark. Every session in the Fallout universe ends the same way eventually. You save the game. The wasteland freezes in place, a sunset over irradiated hills, a settlement quiet with people you have come to know, a terminal in a dark room still displaying whatever message you were reading when you decided to stop. And you step away, back into the world outside your window, and for a moment those two realities sit alongside each other, the one you inhabit and the one that will be waiting, exactly as you left it. Whenever you return, the Fallout universe does something rare. It makes its mysteries feel like they deserve the care you give them. Every ruined vault, and every scattered holotape, and every character who mentions something offhand that turns out to be a thread you can follow for hours. All of it is built with an attention to consequence and implication that rewards the people who are paying attention. The mysteries do not feel arbitrary. They feel like they come from genuine creative curiosity, from people who were interested in the questions they were raising. Who dropped the first bombs, and whether the answer matters once the world has already ended. What is in the dark beneath the Dunwich building, waiting with a patience that long predates the bombs and will long outlast the survivors? How a vault full of ordinary, reasonable people came to hold elections for the privilege of dying, one per year, until there was almost no one left, and the 5 people still alive chose to do the thing that the machine had always wanted. Where a man in a long coat appears from, and where he goes when he leaves, and why a detective with years of evidence on the case still cannot find an answer that satisfies him. How a burned man thrown into a canyon comes back changed rather than destroyed, and what faith looks like when it is not comfortable. What a casino preserved in amber says about the things we cannot release even when holding on is killing us. Whether a vast creature watched from the mountains long before the war and is watching still, what it would actually mean for something manufactured to be a person, in every sense that matters. All the blank spaces on the map and all the lives being lived in them without a player ever watching. These are not just questions about a game. They are questions the Fallout universe carries because they are questions about us, about accountability and mythology, about the way the past follows us into every present we try to build without it, about what we owe to things that are like us and unlike us, about the institutions we build that gradually build us in return, about what remains when almost everything else is gone. The wasteland has 200 years of answers scattered through its ruins. It has not found the ones that matter yet. Neither have we. But it keeps searching, terminal by terminal, vault by vault, ruin by ruin in the warm amber glow of a world lit by fires that have never completely gone out. Get some sleep. The wasteland will be there when you wake up, exactly where you left it, with all of its questions intact and all of its mysteries waiting. If any of these kept you up thinking when you should have been drifting off, that is good, actually. Drop a comment. Tell us which one found you. We love hearing which mystery hits differently on a second playthrough, or which question has been sitting in the back of your mind since the first time you walked into a vault and the door closed behind you. If you enjoyed this video, subscribing makes a genuine difference in keeping this kind of long-form content going. It means the next time we walk slowly through the ruins together, you will be there from the beginning. The wasteland keeps its secrets. We will keep picking through them, together. End of script. Script notes for ElevenLabs voice generation. Deliver the entire script at a slow, even pace, slower than you think is right, and then slower still. The length is the point. Paragraph breaks are breath marks. 2 counts of silence before the next paragraph. Section title transitions should have 4 counts of silence and a slightly lower restart pitch. The tone should be warm, slightly tired in the good way, like someone who has been thinking about something interesting for a long time and is happy to share. The closing section should soften further. By the last 2 paragraphs, the delivery should be close to a whisper. The last line, together, is the landing. Never rush. The listener is trying to sleep. Give the words room. Expansion addendum, the philosophy of the wasteland. What the mysteries are actually about. There is a reason you keep coming back to these mysteries even after you know the evidence. It is not simply curiosity about fictional lore. The Fallout universe's unsolved questions have a specific quality that separates them from the equivalent mysteries in other long-running franchises. They are not puzzles awaiting solutions. They are invitations to think about something that matters. The Great War origin question is the most obvious example. Whether China fired first, or Vault-Tec struck the match, or some rogue faction in the American government triggered the exchanges, at the level of historical documentation, an interesting question about the Fallout canon. But the reason the question persists across decades of community discussion is that it is really a question about moral responsibility in systems too complex for any single actor to fully understand or control. It is asking whether blame is a useful concept when catastrophe emerges from the accumulation of rational individual decisions made by people who each believed they were doing what the situation required. Every faction in the Fallout universe is built around an implicit answer to that question. The Brotherhood of Steel's answer is that knowledge is dangerous and should be controlled, that the apocalypse happened because too many people had access to too much destructive power without the wisdom to use it responsibly. The NCR's answer is that democratic institutions create the accountability that prevents catastrophe, that the problem with the pre-war world was not its values but its failure to live up to them. Caesar's Legion's answer is that the softer civilizations produced weak people who could not make the hard decisions, and that strength of will applied consistently is the only reliable foundation. The Institute's answer is that the surface world is irredeemable, and that the only path forward is controlled, directed research far from the contaminating influence of unmanaged humanity. None of these answers is complete. None of them fully accounts for the wasteland they are trying to navigate. But each one is internally coherent, and each one appeals to real human experiences of the world. The genuine appeal of protecting knowledge, or of believing in institutions, or of trusting strength, or of despair, at the surface world's endless capacity for self-destruction. The mysteries of the Fallout universe keep people engaged because the questions they raise are versions of questions the real world is also asking, in a setting where the consequences have already been fully realized. The bombs have already fallen. The civilization has already ended. There is no intervention possible, no warning to be issued. All that remains is the question of what it means and who was responsible and whether any of it could have been different. That is a specific kind of philosophical space that is very hard to create and very easy to inhabit, which is why people will sit with it for hours, in the dark, letting a narrator walk them through mysteries that will never fully resolve. There is also something worth saying about the role of repetition in how these mysteries work. You play the games more than once. You go back, you know the Dunwich building is coming before you arrive, and yet the experience of the building does not diminish. If anything, it deepens, because you are attending to it differently. You know that Nick's filing cabinet is there, and the second time you find it, you read the note more slowly, and the weight of it lands differently because you know more about Nick now than you did the first time. The mysteries of the Fallout universe are not information to be acquired and filed away. They are textures to be lived in. The repeated player, the person for whom this is a video they might put on when they want to sleep and return to the world they know, is not encountering these questions for the first time. They are visiting them again. The familiarity is part of the comfort. There is something almost meditative about this. The same questions, walked through again, in the same order, with the same unhurried quality of a guide who knows the path and is not in a rush to reach the end. The wasteland as a landscape for revisitation. The mysteries as landmarks in a world you have decided to keep coming back to, not because you expect them to be solved, but because the act of approaching them, attending to them, sitting with them in the dark, does something that you find worthwhile. The mysterious stranger appears when you are in trouble. He solves a problem you could not solve yourself, and then he is gone. There is no explanation. There is no debt recorded. He was there, and now he is not, and the fight continues without him. And after a while, you stop asking why and simply know that sometimes, when things are very bad, he shows up. That is not lore. That is comfort. Dressed in lore, yes, wearing the clothing of a mystery that a detective with decades of files has not been able to crack. But at its foundation, it is the same thing a lot of the best Fallout content is doing, using the specific language of the wasteland to say something about what it is like to move through difficult terrain and occasionally, inexplicably, have something help you. Joshua Graham walked into the Grand Canyon and was not destroyed. He came back changed. He built something from what was left. The Fallout universe presents this without explaining it, because the part of it that matters is not located in theology. It is located in the fact of continuation. He went in, he came back, he found a way to be useful with what remained. That is what the mysteries are, finally, in their deepest register. They are the universe's way of saying, here are things that cannot be explained and that happened anyway. Here are people who should not have survived who did. Here is a building that should not exist, worshipping something that should not be real, and here is a whole community that built a life around that impossibility and found meaning in it. Here is a question with no good answer, and here is a world that learned to keep moving without one. The bombs fell 200 years ago, and the people in the wasteland got up the next morning and started figuring it out. Not because they had answers. Not because the questions had been resolved, because getting up and figuring it out was what was available to them, and available is its own kind of gift. Get some sleep. The wasteland will be there when you wake up. Expansion Addendum. The sound of the wasteland, radio, music, and the mysteries of memory. The Fallout universe has always used its radio stations to do something that no other game series does quite the same way. Place the player inside an act of nostalgia for a world that never existed. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, Radio New Vegas in New Vegas, Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, each of them plays pre-war music that is bright and optimistic and in dialogue with post-war survival in a way that produces a specific emotional resonance. The music is not ironic, exactly. It is not using old songs to comment on how far the world has fallen. It is doing something stranger and more affecting. It is presenting a world that genuinely believed those songs, that meant that cheerfulness, that lived inside that optimism, and placing it directly alongside the ruins of everything that world built. The mystery of pre-war radio in the Fallout universe is partly a question of preservation. How are these songs still playing? Some of the stations have human DJs, like Three Dog in Fallout 3, who selected and programmed the music themselves. Others, like Diamond City Radio, have a human host reading news and commentary between songs that were presumably drawn from some archive of pre-war recordings. The music itself has survived on some form of storage media that has outlasted 2 centuries of radiation and decay, which implies either extraordinary engineering or extraordinary luck or some combination of both. Mr. New Vegas is the most interesting radio mystery in the series, and he deserves the sustained attention that the games never quite give him. He is an AI. He sounds like a warm, professional, slightly weary late-night radio host. He describes events in the Mojave with the balanced tone of a journalist who has learned to present information without editorializing. He thanks his listeners. He wishes them well. He speaks to the wasteland with the assumption that the people listening are doing all right, that the world outside their windows is a reasonably navigable place. Whether Mr. New Vegas knows what the world outside actually looks like is one of those questions the game raises and then simply does not answer. He mentions Raider attacks and NCR Legion conflicts and the specific brutal details of life in the Mojave with the same register he uses for everything else, the way a professional broadcaster has learned to keep their voice. Steady regardless of the content? Because the voice is the product, and steadiness is what keeps people listening. The philosophical question of whether his equanimity is the equanimity of an AI that has no capacity for distress, or the equanimity of an entity that has had 200 years to find peace with what the world has become, is left permanently open. There is also the question of what Mr. New Vegas thinks he is doing. He was presumably designed before the war to be a radio entertainer. His function has not changed. He is still doing what his design specified. But the audience has changed entirely. The world his programming was designed to serve, the people who were supposed to be his listeners, are all gone. What he has instead is survivors. Raiders who might tune in occasionally. Settlers working the fields of Goodsprings. Couriers moving across the Mojave, listening to familiar music in unfamiliar terrain. The boomers, locked in Nellis Air Force Base, who receive his signal through walls of scavenged metal. He speaks to all of them with the same warmth, making no distinctions, playing the same music for the person trying to find water as for the person planning an ambush. That is what radio does. It cannot know its audience, only address it. And there is something strangely moving about an AI that has maintained that fidelity to its original purpose across 2 centuries, always speaking, to whoever might be listening, in the hope that the message reaches someone who needed it. Three Dog is a different mystery entirely, because Three Dog is human, and therefore finite, and the question of what happens to Galaxy News Radio when he is gone is one the game raises in the ending slides without resolving. Fallout 3's various endings describe different fates for the Capital Wasteland, but Three Dog's radio station is more fragile than any of them. It depends on one person, one voice, one individual maintaining his particular combination of idealism and stubbornness. The mystery of Three Dog is the mystery of how personality-driven institutions survive their founders. What comes after someone who built something from nothing but their own conviction? The game does not tell you. The signal continues for as long as you are playing, and then you stop, and the question of whether it continues after that is one you are left to answer for yourself. The pre-war music has its own uncanny quality once you know what you are listening to. These were songs written in our world, recorded in our world, placed into a game that imagines a world that developed differently from ours and then destroyed itself in a way ours has not. The cheerfulness of these songs is real. They were cheerful in our world. They came from a genuine cultural moment of mid-century optimism. But in the context of the wasteland, they become something else. Evidence of a civilization that believed it was building towards something, that was invested in its own future, that produced this music as an expression of genuine forward momentum. And then the forward momentum ended, the bombs fell, and the music plays on. There is a terminal entry somewhere in the Fallout games. The exact location escapes this particular telling, but it exists where a vault dweller describes listening to pre-war music in the vault and being confused by the emotional response it produces. The music is pleasant. The music is simple. The music asks nothing of the listener. But the vault dweller finds herself weeping without fully understanding why, until she realizes she is not crying about anything specific in the song. She is crying about the world that produced it, a world that no longer exists and that she never knew directly, a world she knows about only through scraps and records, and the songs that keep playing in a vault buried underground. Grief for a world you never lived in, carried in music you did not choose to remember. That is the Fallout universe in one terminal entry. That is what all these mysteries, followed far enough, eventually arrive at. A note on the Brotherhood of Steel and the question they never answer. No accounting of Fallout's deep mysteries would feel complete without addressing the faction that has appeared in every mainline entry and that remains, across all of them, fundamentally unresolved at its core. The Brotherhood of Steel is the series' most persistently present institution, and the question it raises, whether the hoarding of knowledge and technology is a form of protection or a form of theft, is one that the games keep asking without ever landing on a single answer. The Brotherhood was founded by Captain Roger Maxson, a U.S. Army officer stationed at Mariposa Military Base, the facility where the FEV research was being conducted. Maxson discovered what was being done to civilian workers at the base, human beings used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent, subjected to forced evolutionary virus experiments under the supervision of scientists who had simply decided that the research justified the cost. Maxson ordered his men to execute the scientists responsible. Then he led his unit into the California desert and built something new from the wreckage of his former allegiance. What Maxson built, and what the Brotherhood has been ever since, is a military organization organized around the premise that certain technologies are too dangerous to be widely distributed. The power armor that Maxson and his soldiers wore when they founded the Brotherhood became both the practical basis of their power and the symbolic core of their ideology. They have what the Wasteland needs, and they will decide who gets access to it. The mystery of the Brotherhood is not what they do. They collect technology, they restrict access, they occasionally cooperate with surface communities and occasionally war with them, depending on chapter and leadership and local circumstance. The mystery is whether what they do is coherent, whether there is a version of their project that actually works, that actually produces the outcome they claim to be pursuing. The East Coast Brotherhood under Elder Lyons, in Fallout 3, diverged from the West Coast orthodoxy by choosing to actively help the Capital Wasteland's human communities rather than simply extracting and hoarding. Lyons' daughter Sarah carried this forward until her death. When the Lone Wanderer activates Project Purity, the Brotherhood's involvement is what makes the purified water broadly accessible without their military muscle, and their willingness to defend the purifier. The Enclave controls the water supply, and the Wasteland continues to die. In that version of events, the Brotherhood is heroic. They deployed their hoarded power on behalf of people who needed it. But the West Coast Brotherhood, as depicted in New Vegas, is a dying institution whose refusal to adapt or share has left them besieged in Helios 1 and the Hidden Valley Bunker, fighting a losing war against the NCR while the territory they were supposed to be protecting falls apart around them. Elder McNamara's lockdown is not a strategic posture. It is the organizational equivalent of pulling the blanket over your head. The Brotherhood's insistence on their own primacy in a world that has moved on without them is producing their extinction, slowly, and they know it. And Fallout 4's Brotherhood under Elder Maxson, young, intense, ideologically committed to a version of the Brotherhood's mission that is considerably more aggressive than either Lyons or McNamara, is building a campaign of extermination against synths on grounds that are philosophically unstable, applying the logic of technological quarantine to beings who are demonstrably persons, and doing so with all the institutional confidence of an organization that has never seriously interrogated its own foundational assumptions. The Brotherhood is the mystery of institution building in miniature. An organization founded in response to genuine wrongdoing, organized around a genuine insight that some technologies are dangerous and that their spread should be managed, that has calcified over 200 years into something that can no longer distinguish between the insight, the power structure that grew around it. What Maxson understood was that FEV research had killed people. What the Brotherhood remembers is that they are the ones who stand between the Wasteland and the next Mariposa. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the Brotherhood's mystery lies. No Fallout game has resolved this. Each one adds another angle, another Brotherhood chapter doing another version of the same fundamental argument with a different outcome. The question of whether the Brotherhood is the Wasteland's best hope or its most persistent obstacle is one that the series keeps asking because it is asking something real about whether institutions built in response to genuine danger can survive long enough to remember why the danger mattered, or whether they inevitably become the thing they were created to prevent. A locked vault full of power armor and laser rifles, built to protect the world, protecting it by never letting the world inside. That is Fallout. That is the Brotherhood. That is the mystery that every rusted bunker door in every Brotherhood installation poses without answering. Who decided you needed protecting? And did anyone ask? The Enclave, America's last ghost and its refusal to die. If the Brotherhood is an institution that calcified around a genuine insight, the Enclave is something darker. An institution that survived the apocalypse by becoming indistinguishable from it while continuing to describe itself as its cure. The Enclave is the remnant of the United States federal government, or rather a particular strand of it, the strand that went underground, into hardened facilities, carrying classified research and military hardware, and a political philosophy that had been gestating in secret since before the bombs fell. By the time the Fallout games encounter the Enclave, it is a military organization that operates out of old oil rigs and aircraft carriers and remote bunkers, fighting to reclaim control of a continent it has not governed in 2 centuries while referring to wasteland survivors as mutants, unworthy of the resources they are standing on. The Enclave's central mystery is not what they want. They want power. They want the United States back, under their control, and they are willing to use biological weapons to remove the populations that are currently inhabiting the territory they intend to reclaim. That is stated policy in Fallout 2, where the Enclave's plan to deploy a modified strain of FEV to kill anyone with significant radiation exposure, meaning everyone who survived the war is the central threat the player is racing to prevent. The mystery is the people inside the institution. The Enclave has soldiers and scientists and administrators and bureaucrats who wake up every morning in a facility that looks like a functioning government building, wear uniforms that come from a country that dissolved before their grandparents were born, follow protocols that assume the existence of a chain of command that has not been legitimate for 200 years, and frame their work as national service to a nation that exists only in their own institutional memory. President Richardson in Fallout 2 is genuinely interesting because he is not, at the level of individual psychology, obviously villainous. He believes what he is saying. The Enclave's position, as he presents it, is that they are the legitimate government of the United States, that the wasteland survivors are an unfortunate contaminated population that cannot be allowed to persist if a real civilization is going to be rebuilt, and that the hard decision of clearing that population is the kind of thing governments sometimes have to do. He is calm. He is reasonable in his manner. He is describing a genocide in the same register you would use to describe a municipal infrastructure project. That specific quality, the bureaucratic normalization of total horror, is one of the things the Fallout series keeps returning to, and the Enclave is its clearest expression. The mystery is not that evil exists in the wasteland. Raiders exist, slavers exist. People who have simply decided that their survival justifies whatever they do to other people exist in every corner of every game. The mystery of the Enclave is that evil can put on a uniform and a title and a procedural framework and become genuinely difficult to distinguish from governance, from the outside. That the people perpetrating the worst things the series depicts are not the ones who have abandoned the idea of civilization, they are the ones who are most committed to a specific vision of it. The Enclave remnants in Fallout 3 complicate this further. By the events of that game, the main Enclave force under President Eden and Colonel Autumn has been broken. What remains is scattered former soldiers who no longer have an institution to serve, navigating the question of what they are without the framework that defined them. Some of them become raiders, which is a coherent progression. Some of them drift into legitimate wasteland communities. And a small group, in the Broken Steel DLC, joins the Brotherhood of Steel in fighting what remains of their own former organization. That last group is the most interesting. What do you do when the institution you served was wrong? When the uniform you wore represented something you have had to revise? The Enclave remnants who choose to help the Brotherhood are not absolved of what they did. The fact of their service, their participation in the machine while the machine was doing what it did, does not vanish. But they made a different choice, eventually. And the game does not tell you whether that is enough, or what enough would even look like. Every Fallout faction is, in its way, a question about institutions and the people who serve them. The Enclave asks the darkest version of that question, and it asks it quietly, with clean uniforms and procedural language, and the genuine conviction of people who have convinced themselves that what they are doing is necessary. The wasteland has a lot of enemies. None of them are as unsettling as the ones who think they are the solution.